At my eldest daughter's funeral, my son-in-law walked in holding my younger daughter's hand. After most of the guests had left, he came over to me beside the coffin and whispered, "Don't worry, Dad. I'll take over her company well, and her younger sister too." Then a familiar laugh suddenly came from inside the coffin. The entire room fell silent. My son-in-law panicked and stumbled backward to the floor. "Welcome to revenge, Dad. Before we dive in, drop a quick comment for me. What are you doing while you listen? Driving, working, or just winding down? Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Just a heads up, some details in this story have been adjusted for storytelling and reflection. What matters most is the message it carries. I never thought I would outlive my daughter. At 60, standing in a Fells Point funeral home on a November Thursday, I watched my son-in-law smile at mourners like a man who just inherited an empire. The chapel at Ensor Funeral Home held 200 people, maybe more. White lilies lined the walls, their scent thick enough to make my throat close. Harbor fog pressed against the tall windows, turning Baltimore's skyline into gray ghosts. At the front of the room, Margot Garrison, 34 years old. My eldest daughter, the sharp mind behind our family's $8 million shipping operation, lay perfectly still in a mahogany casket. Keith Brennan, 42, had joined our company 7 years back as VP of Acquisitions and married Margot a year later. His tailored suit cost more than most dock workers earned in a month. He moved through the crowd with Leora at his side, shaking hands, accepting condolences, his face arranged in what I supposed was meant to look like grief. Leora Garrison, 34. My younger daughter and the family's trust fund manager wore a Chanel suit as black and pristine as her calculated sorrow. Her eyes were perfectly dry. She touched Keith's elbow every few minutes, steering him from one cluster of mourners to the next, like they were working a merger negotiation, not burying family. I'd spent 35 years reading faces at the Baltimore Port Authority, managing harbor traffic, and the men who worked it. You learned what grief looked like when a dock worker lost a friend to a winch accident or a captain got news from home. Real grief didn't smile. It didn't network. This wasn't it. Pastor Carlson from St. Mary's, a man I'd seen officiate 100 harbor funerals over the years, stood at the podium and delivered the eulogy with practiced solemnity. Margot Garrison lived with purpose. He said, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. A daughter of Baltimore's harbor, a leader in our maritime community taken far too soon. I stood near the back watching. Lyle Garrison, my younger brother at 63, stood beside me in his pressed three-piece suit, silver hair unchanged in 3 decades. He'd been drafting our shipping contracts since before Margot was born. Unlike Keith and Leora, Lyle actually looked at the casket. His jaw was tight. His hands were steady on the back of the pew in front of us. "They're not even pretending," Lyle murmured. "No," I said. "They're not." The casket was mahogany. Margot had always loved the way wood aged near salt water. The way it darkened took on character, became something more than what it started as. She'd picked that wood for the deck of our first commercial vessel back when she was 26 and I'd just promoted her to operations director. Keith had argued for fiberglass. Margot had won. Keith leaned close to a woman I recognized from the Maritime Association, his hand on her shoulder, his voice low and warm. Leora handed tissues to an older man. I didn't know her expression, soft with sympathy that never reached her eyes. They worked the room like executives at a business opportunity. When the service ended, mourners lined up to approach the casket for final goodbyes. I waited, let them file past murmuring prayers and pressing fingertips to the polished wood. Let them embrace Keith and Leora and tell them how sorry they were, how unexpected this tragedy had been. When most of the crowd had filtered toward the reception hall, I moved forward. Lyle stayed back, giving me space. Keith was beside the casket when I reached it. Leora stood 2 feet behind him, watching. Up close, Margot looked peaceful. Her face was composed, hands folded across her chest, dark hair arranged perfectly around her shoulders. She wore the navy dress she'd bought for last year's Maritime Commission gala. No visible injuries. The medical examiner had ruled it cardiac arrest, sudden, unexplained, tragic in a woman so young. I rested my hand on the edge of the casket. The wood was cool and smooth. Keith leaned close, his shoulder nearly touching mine. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, meant only for me. "Get some rest, old man," he said. "The shipping assets, the properties, everything Margot left behind, Leora and I will handle it far better than she ever did. I turned my head slowly to look at him. His expression was pleasant, almost sympathetic, not a trace of shame. Better than she did, I repeated. Much better, Keith said. Then I heard it. Soft, impossible, real. A laugh. It came from inside the casket, low, warm, knowing. The same laugh I'd heard 10,000 times across 34 years. The laugh Margot made when she was 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room, when she'd just closed a contract. No one thought she could win when she knew something nobody else had figured out yet. Keith jerked back his face, draining white. His hand flew to his chest. Did you? He started. Leora's fingers clamped onto his arm. We should step back, she said, her voice tight. She didn't look at the casket. She pulled Keith toward the exit without looking back. I stood motionless, my hand still resting on the polished mahogany. Margot's face hadn't changed. Peaceful. Still. Exactly as it had been. But I'd heard that laugh. I knew it the way I knew the sound of a ship's horn echoing off the harbor at dawn, the way I knew the rhythm of waves against the pier pylons. That laugh was Margot's. No mistake, no question. Keith's face had drained white. Leora steered him toward the chapel doors, her grip firm on his elbow. Neither of them looked back. I stood alone beside the casket, the scent of lilies pressing close fog still gray against the windows. My hand stayed on the wood-solid, cool, sealed shut. That laugh, unmistakable, deliberate, meant something. If Margot was dead, what had I just heard? And if she wasn't dead, where was she? The last mourners filed out at 4 o'clock. I waited until the chapel emptied, until the low murmur of condolences faded into the hallway, until only the scent of lilies and the November rain tapping against the windows remained. Harold Morrison, the funeral director, a thin man in his late 50s with practiced sympathy, who'd buried half of Baltimore's harbor families over 40 years, approached quietly from the side door. Mr. Garrison, he said, take all the time you need. I'll be in my office if you require anything. Thank you, I said. He nodded and left, pulling the double doors closed behind him with a soft click. I stood alone with the casket. The chapel was silent except for the rain and the distant hum of the building's heating system. I moved closer, my hand reaching for the polished mahogany edge. Up close, Margot looked exactly as she had. An hour ago, peaceful, composed, her dark hair arranged carefully around her shoulders, hands folded across her chest. I touched her hand. Cold. Not the cold of 3 days dead, but the artificial cold of refrigeration, of preservation, of funeral home preparation. The skin felt wrong, too firm, too perfect, like wax. I'd heard that laugh. I knew what I'd heard. I leaned closer, examining the casket's interior, white silk lining, quilted and smooth. I ran my fingers along the edge where the fabric met the wood, searching for anything unusual, any explanation for the sound that had sent Keith running. My hand stopped near Margot's left shoulder. There beneath the silk, a small irregularity. I pressed gently and felt something hard, rectangular, no bigger than my thumb. I worked my fingers under the fabric edge and pulled it back carefully. A device, electronic, black plastic casing with a tiny speaker grill, still faintly warm. Someone had planted this. Someone had triggered it, remotely timed it perfectly. For the moment, Keith whispered his plans to liquidate everything Margot had built. Someone wanted me to hear that laugh. Someone wanted me to know. I held the device in my palm, feeling the residual heat from its operation. The laugh had been recorded, Margot's voice, her distinctive tone captured and embedded in this tiny piece of technology hidden beneath the casket lining. My daughter had either planned this herself, or someone who knew her intimately had. I slipped the device into my coat pocket and turned my attention back to the body. The navy dress. I recognized it immediately. Armani tailored the one Margot wore for contract signings, worth over $1 million. She'd bought it 3 years ago for a shipping deal with a logistics company out of Philadelphia. I'd helped her pick it out, had waited in the department store while she tried on 6 different cuts before settling on this one. It's about presence, Dad, she'd said, studying herself in the mirror. When you walk into a room worth 8 figures, you need to look like you belong there. She'd worn it to closings, negotiations, board meetings. It was her armor. I reached for the vest beneath the dress jacket, the way I'd seen Margot do 100 times when she was checking for her phone or her business cards. My fingers found the small interior pocket, paper, folded in quarters. I pulled it out carefully, my heart hammering against my ribs. The paper was heavy stock cream-colored, the kind Margot used for personal correspondence. I unfolded it slowly. Handwriting, navy blue ink. Margot's distinctive script, the capital M, with its sharp angles the way her lowercase letters slanted just slightly to the right. The firm pressure of someone who'd signed 1,000 shipping contracts. 4 sentences, 23 words total. The person in this casket isn't me. Find out who they are, Dad. Port Covington, Unit 14. Come alone tonight. I read it 3 times, 4 times. The words didn't change. The woman in this casket isn't me. I looked down at the body. The face was Margot's, or close enough that 200 mourners had filed past without question. Close enough that I'd stood here for 10 minutes studying it before finding the note. But now, knowing I could see the differences, the nose was slightly wider, the chin less pointed, the hands a fraction larger. Someone had prepared this person to look like my daughter. Someone had dressed them in Margot's clothes, arranged their hair the same way, presented them to Baltimore's maritime community as Margot Garrison, deceased at 34 from sudden cardiac arrest. And Margot, my actual daughter, had left me instructions. Port Covington, Unit 14. I knew Port Covington. Industrial district south of the harbor, mostly warehouses and cold storage facilities. Unit 14 would be a storage locker, probably at the main facility off Hanover Street. Come alone tonight. I folded the note and slipped it into my breast pocket left side over my heart, where Margot knew I kept things that mattered. My fingers touched the outline of the audio device in my other pocket. If my daughter had planned this, the substitute body, the funeral, the planted device, the note she'd orchestrated, everything with the same precision she brought to shipping contracts and acquisition deals. If someone else had planted these clues, if someone was using Margot's disappearance to manipulate me, then she was in danger. I couldn't yet calculate. Either way, I needed answers. I touched the edge of the casket one more time, looking at the woman who wasn't my daughter. Someone had died. Someone had been prepared and presented as Margot Garrison. Someone's family might be searching for her right now, not knowing she lay in a Fells Point funeral home under a false name. "Who are you?" I whispered. The body offered no answer. Only the rain responded steady against the windows and the distant sound of Harold Morrison's footsteps in the hallway. I walked toward the chapel doors, my hand resting over the note above my heart. The November evening was settling into darkness outside, fog rolling in from the Chesapeake, the kind of weather that turned Baltimore's industrial district into a maze of shadows and sodium lights. Port Covington Unit 14 waited in that darkness. And if Margot was alive, she was waiting there too. If she wasn't, if someone else had written that note, planted that device, staged this entire performance, then I was walking into a trap. I pulled out my phone as I stepped into the rain-soaked parking lot. One call, one person I trusted absolutely. Lyle answered on the second ring. "I need you," I said. "Port Covington tonight. And Lyle, bring your notary seal. We might need to document what we find." Lyle met me at Johns Hopkins Hospital at 9. Friday morning, with 2 coffees and the look of a man who'd been awake as long as I had. We'd talked past midnight after I'd left the funeral home, and he'd convinced me to start with the official record before we went anywhere near Port Covington. Before we open any cold storage units, he'd said on the phone, his lawyer's instinct kicking in, "We need to understand what the paperwork claims killed your daughter." So here we stood in the medical examiner's office on a November morning that smelled like disinfectant and old coffee, waiting for the records clerk to pull Margot's file. Janet Kowalski, the medical records clerk, was a tired woman in her 50s who'd seen enough death certificates to know when something didn't add up. She brought the file to us in a gray conference room with fluorescent lights that hummed too loud and windows that looked out over the hospital parking garage. "This is what we have for Margot Garrison," she said, sliding the folder across the table. "Died November 18th. I remember this one young woman, no obvious trauma. Chief medical examiner signed off personally." "Thank you," I said. She nodded and left us alone. Lyle opened the file. I watched his face as he read, watched the small muscle in his jaw tighten the way it did when he found problems in shipping contracts. "Official cause of death, sudden cardiac arrest," he said. "Signed by Dr. Cassius Mercer, Chief Medical Examiner for Baltimore." The name hit me like cold water. Cassius Mercer. I knew that name. Not from medical circles or harbor business, but from somewhere personal, somewhere connected to Margot. "Mercer," I said. "I know that name." "At Chief M.E., Lyle said. "Been in the position about 8 years. Before that, he was Hopkins faculty." I finished the memory clicking into place. Margot's undergraduate advisor. They stayed friends. She had dinner with him and his wife maybe twice a year. Lyle looked up from the file. Your daughter's death certificate was signed by her personal friend. That's either very convenient, I said, or very deliberate. Lyle turned the page. The attending physician's notes mention irregularities upon intake, but defer to Mercer's final ruling. Listen to this. Body temperature and rigor mortis advancement suggest timeline inconsistencies. Recommend further pathological examination. But Mercer's signature overrides it. No autopsy performed. Did Margot have heart problems? Lyle asked. Any history of cardiac issues? None, I said. She ran 3 miles every morning along the inner harbor, rain or shine. 15 years without missing more than a handful of days. Hearts like hers don't just stop. Lyle pulled another sheet from the file, the intake log from the hospital morgue. He studied it for a long moment, then slid it across to me. And look at the timestamp, he said. I read the entry. Body received November 18th, 2024, 23:47. Temperature upon intake 34.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Rigor mortis advanced stage 3. Delivered by Keith Brennan's spouse. 11:47 p.m., I said. Keith reported her dead at 9 o'clock. What took almost 3 hours? That's not the problem, Lyle said quietly. Look at the core temperature. 34.2 degrees Fahrenheit. I'd spent 35 years around Baltimore Harbor, knew what cold did to things, knew the temperature of refrigerated cargo holds and ice storage facilities. That's refrigeration, I said. The attending physician noted it. Lyle said, pointing to a handwritten comment in the margin. Body temp inconsistent with reported time of death. Rigor mortis accelerated. Recommend further examination. But Mercer shut it down. It's signed off within an hour of intake, Lyle confirmed. No autopsy, no additional examination, cause of death cardiac arrest. Case closed. I sat back in the plastic chair, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Margot had supposedly died at home at 9 p.m. on November 18th. Keith had brought her body to Johns Hopkins nearly 3 hours later, and when she arrived, she was cold. Not the cold of death, but the cold of industrial refrigeration. She was kept somewhere, I said, between 9 p.m. and midnight, somewhere with temperature control, somewhere with the capacity to store a body, Lyle added, which narrows it significantly. Cold storage facilities, industrial freezers, medical. Port Covington, I said. Lyle nodded slowly. Your note said Unit 14, cold storage locker. The question is where she was really kept, I said. If the body delivered to Johns Hopkins was already refrigerated already in rigor mortis, then Margot died, or whoever this woman is, died hours before Keith reported it, and someone had access to facilities that could preserve her. Lyle closed the file carefully. If she wasn't at Johns Hopkins between 9 p.m. and midnight on the 18th, where was she? I thought about Margot's note folded in my breast pocket. Port Covington Unit 14. I thought about the substitute body and the mahogany casket, the audio device planted beneath the silk, the careful orchestration of the funeral. We've been asking the wrong question, I said. What do you mean? We keep asking if Margot is dead or alive, I said. But the medical evidence says someone died. Someone was refrigerated and delivered to Johns Hopkins on November 18th. Someone is in that casket at Ensor Funeral Home right now. So the question is, whose body did Keith deliver? I finished. Because if it wasn't Margot, then where is my daughter, and whose body are we burying tomorrow? Lyle looked at me across the sterile conference room, the manila folder between us, like evidence in a trial neither of us had prepared for. Port Covington, he said. This afternoon. This afternoon, I agreed. We left the hospital and walked into November fog that had rolled in from the Chesapeake, turning Baltimore's downtown into gray shapes and distant sounds. Somewhere in that fog, in an industrial district full of warehouses and cold storage facilities, Unit 14 waited. And if Margot was alive, if she'd orchestrated this elaborate deception, planted clues left me breadcrumbs to follow, then she was waiting there too. If she wasn't, if someone else had staged this, then I was about to discover exactly how deep the conspiracy against my daughter went. Port Covington in November is all cargo containers and fog. Lyle and I pulled into the cold storage facility at 2 that afternoon. The address from Margot's note leading us past chain-link fence into a warren of refrigerated warehouses where nobody asks questions about what gets stored or how long. The main office was a squat concrete building with security cameras pointed at the gate. We drove past it without stopping, following the numbered units deeper into the complex. Rows of identical metal doors stretched into the fog, each marked with stenciled numbers. Unit 14 was in the back row, tucked between an empty unit and one marked with a seafood distributor's logo. I parked and cut the engine. Through the windshield, fog swirled around sodium lights that were already glowing despite the afternoon hour. The temperature had dropped since we left Johns Hopkins. My breath fogged the air when I opened the door. Lyle pulled a camera from his briefcase as we approached Unit 14. The door was industrial-grade steel secured with a heavy padlock that looked newer than the surrounding rust. "Before we open it," Lyle said, raising the camera, "I'm documenting everything. If this is what I think it is, the FBI will need clean evidence." He photographed the lock, the door, the unit number, the surrounding area. Flash after flash cut through the fog. I weighted my hand in my coat pocket, feeling the weight of the small brass key that had been taped inside Margot's note. "Whenever you're ready," Lyle said. I stepped forward and fitted the key into the padlock. It turned smoothly oiled, recently maintained. The lock clicked open. "Margot left this for me," I said. "Whatever's inside, she wanted me to find it." I pulled the lock free and lifted the unit's handle. The door swung outward on well-maintained hinges. Cold hit like a wall. Not November cold, but industrial refrigeration, the kind designed for cargo that needs to stay frozen for months crossing oceans. -4°C, maybe colder. The air that rolled out carried the sharp chemical scent of preservatives and the metallic tang of refrigeration coils. Lyle found the light switch. Fluorescent tubes flickered to life overhead, revealing a space maybe 10 feet by 12. Bare metal walls, frost on the floor, and on an aluminum platform in the center of the unit, a body. A young man laid out with the same care someone had used for the woman in Margot's casket. Dark suit, white shirt, hands crossed over his chest. His face was peaceful eyes, closed skin, pale from cold and death. Professional preservation. Deliberate positioning. "Dear God," I whispered. Lyle stepped inside, camera rays documenting everything. The flash reflected off frost-covered walls. I forced myself to move closer to look at the young man's face. I knew him, not well, not personally, but I'd seen him in the hallways at Garrison Maritime, past him in the break room, signed payroll sheets with his name on them. I pulled a handkerchief from my pocket and carefully lifted the ID badge clipped to his suit jacket. The laminated card confirmed what I already knew. Daniel Oakes, employee number 3847, Compliance Department, Garrison Maritime. 29 years old, 3 weeks missing. Nobody filed a police report because Keith had told everyone Daniel took sudden family leave, gone home to Virginia to help his sick mother. We'd believed the lie because we had no reason not to. "Eugene," Lyle's voice was careful. "You know him?" "Daniel Oakes," I said. "He worked for us, Compliance Department, hired about 18 months ago, fresh out of Georgetown, with a degree in maritime law. Smart kid, thorough. Margot liked him because he actually read the regulations instead of just filing them." "When did he disappear?" 3 weeks ago, late October. I let the ID badge drop back against Daniel's chest. Keith said it was family leave, emergency back home. Lyle was photographing the shelf mounted on the far wall. "There's an envelope here, addressed to you." I turned, a manila envelope sealed with one word written in navy blue ink across the front, "Dad." I recognized Margot's handwriting immediately. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside a USB drive and 3 photographs, professional quality, telephoto lens, time-stamped October 30th. The first photo showed Daniel Oakes sitting at an outdoor table at Rusty Scupper, the waterfront restaurant near the harbor. Across from him, Keith Brennan and Leora Garrison. Documents spread on the table between them, Keith's hand reaching for something Daniel was holding. The second photo, Leora checking her phone while Keith and Daniel talked. Daniel's expression was serious. Keith's was pleasant, friendly, the way he looked when closing a deal. The third photo, Daniel standing up from the table, documents in hand. Keith's expression had changed. No longer friendly, something harder. Lyle photographed each picture over my shoulder. October 30th. That's 3 weeks before Margot's funeral, 1 week before Daniel disappeared. He was meeting with them, I said, deliberately, outside the office. Whatever he found in our compliance files, he confronted them about it. And they killed him for it, Lyle finished. I looked back at Daniel's body on the aluminum platform, a young man who'd done his job too well, who'd found something wrong in our shipping contracts or financial records or regulatory filings, who'd tried to do the right thing by bringing it to management's attention. And Keith and Leora had murdered him. Then they'd used his body as Margot's substitute, dressed him in her clothes, prepared him with the same care, delivered him to Johns Hopkins with a false identity. Dr. Cassius Mercer had signed the death certificate without question, and Daniel Oakes had been buried as Margot Garrison. Except Margot had known. She documented it, left me proof. This wasn't just fraud, I said, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. This was murder. Lyle was already pulling out his phone fingers, moving across the screen. I'm calling the FBI. This is beyond local police jurisdiction, interstate commerce, maritime regulations, murder in connection with business fraud. I held the photograph staring at Daniel's serious young face. He'd been trying to expose something worth killing to hide. The question was what he'd discovered that was worth murdering a 29-year-old compliance officer to protect. The answer was on the USB drive in my hand. Whatever evidence Daniel had gathered, whatever files he'd shown Keith and Leora at that waterfront meeting, Margot had collected it all. And now she'd left it for me to find. By 7 that evening, we were in Lyle's office on the 22nd floor, with the USB drive, a pot of coffee neither of us touched, and the kind of silence that comes before you learn something you can't unlearn. Lyle's law firm occupied the corner suite of a downtown building, with views of the inner harbor. Through the windows, cargo ships moved through the channel, their lights cutting through November darkness. I'd watched that harbor my entire adult life. Tonight, it looked like a stranger's city. Lyle inserted the USB drive into his laptop. The screen filled with 3 folders: emails, financials, audio. Which first, he asked. Emails, I said. Let's see what they were saying to each other. He clicked the folder. Dozens of files appeared organized by date. The earliest was March 15th, the most recent November 17th, one day before Margot's reported death. Lyle opened the March file, an email thread between Keith's personal account and an address I didn't recognize, but the signature at the bottom read simply L. Leora. Lyle read aloud. Phase 2 begins once M is handled. E will be easy, old man trusts everyone. 3 months maximum, then we liquidate everything and disappear. M is Margot, I said, my voice flat. E is me. They were planning this in March, Lyle said. 8 months ago. He clicked through more emails. The language was careful coded, but the intent was clear. References to removing obstacles, discussion of asset division, instructions for offshore account setup. In June, confirmation that Daniel Oakes was asking too many questions about regulatory compliance. In July, agreement that Daniel needed to be handled permanently. I thought about Daniel's body in Unit 14. 29 years old, murdered because he'd done his job too well. Lyle opened the financials folder. Spreadsheets appeared, wire transfer records, account, statements, transaction logs. He scrolled through them, his lawyer's eye-catching patterns I would have missed. $2.1 million, he said finally. March through October, 50 separate transactions, none larger than 60,000. Small enough to avoid automatic reporting triggers. From Garrison Maritime. From 6 different company accounts, Lyle said, highlighting entries. Operations, payroll, client, escrow, maintenance reserves. They spread it across the entire business structure. 3 destination accounts, all in the Cayman Islands, all registered to shell corporations. $2 million, more than most Baltimore Harbor families earned in a lifetime. Stolen in increments too small to trigger alerts, buried in enough legitimate transactions that even our accountant hadn't noticed. Margot found this, I said. That's why she hired Daniel. She suspected something and brought in fresh eyes from compliance. And when Daniel confirmed it, Lyle said, they killed him. He closed the spreadsheet and moved the cursor to the audio folder. 5 files each labeled with a date. The earliest from September, the most recent from November 10th. Lyle clicked the September file. Static then voices. Phone call recorded from one end. Keith's voice came through clearly. The only real variable now. Once he's gone, we control everything. The company, the properties, Margot's trust fund. Another voice responded. Female. Familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. Make it look natural, the woman said. Heart attack, stroke, accident. He's 60. Nobody questions an old man dying. The bourbon idea could work, Keith said. Gift from a grateful client. He'd never suspect. How long? Cassius says 2 weeks with the right dosage. Gradual deterioration. Looks like natural decline. And you trust him? He signed Margot's death certificate without question, Keith said. He'll do the same for Eugene. I knew that voice. The woman's voice. I'd heard it at 8 years old asking for bedtime stories, at 16 asking to borrow the car, at her sister's wedding giving a toast that made everyone cry. Leora, my younger daughter discussing my murder with the clinical detachment of someone ordering office supplies. That's Leora, I said, though Lyle had already figured it out. That's her voice. Lyle stopped the recording. His hand was shaking slightly on the mouse. Eugene, play the rest, I said. He clicked the November 10th file. Same voices, different conversation. Cassius confirmed the thallium is undetectable in bourbon, Leora said. The bitter taste blends with the whiskey. Eugene drinks 2 fingers every night before bed. 6 weeks and he'll be dead. And the company transfers to us, Keith finished. Everything transfers to us, Leora corrected. The business, the real estate, the maritime contracts. Margot's trust reverts to me as sole surviving sibling. Eugene's estate splits between you as executor and me as next of kin. 3 months after his funeral, we sell everything and vanish. What about Lyle, the lawyer? Leora's laugh was cold. He'll process the paperwork like he always does. By the time he realizes anything's wrong, we'll be in Grand Cayman living off $8 million. Lyle stopped the recording. The office was completely silent, except for the hum of the laptop and the distant sound of traffic 22 floors below. $8 million. They'd valued the entire family business, 3 generations of work, my life, and Margot's at $8 million. I need to call the FBI, Lyle said quietly. This is attempted murder conspiracy interstate wire fraud. This goes federal. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number from memory. Someone answered quickly. Agent Blackwell, Lyle said. It's Lyle Garrison. I'm calling about a federal matter, murder conspiracy embezzlement involving a Baltimore maritime company. I'm with the victim now. We have recorded confessions and financial evidence. A pause while he listened. Yes, tonight, as soon as possible. Another pause. Eugene Garrison. His daughter was murdered 3 weeks ago, her body replaced with a substitute. The conspirators are his son-in-law and younger daughter. They're planning to kill him next. He gave the office address and hung up. She's coming now, Lyle said. FBI Special Agent Iris Blackwell, White Collar Crime Division. She'll want to see everything. I sat in the leather chair across from Lyle's desk and looked out at Baltimore's harbor lights. Somewhere in this city, Keith and Leora were having dinner, or watching television, or sleeping peacefully, believing their plan was working perfectly. Believing Margot was dead, Daniel was forgotten, and I would be next. They'd been planning this for 8 months. March through November, spring through fall, every Sunday dinner, every board meeting, every casual conversation, while they calculated how to steal everything I'd built and kill me to cover their tracks. And I'd seen nothing, believed every lie, trusted my own daughter to the point of blindness. Agent Blackwell arrived at Lyle's office past midnight. We spent 3 hours walking her through everything the USB drive, the photographs, Daniel Oak's body still refrigerated at Port Covington. She took notes, asked sharp questions, promised nothing except that she'd need time to build a prosecutable case. I went home at 3 a.m. to my Federal Hill apartment overlooking the harbor. Didn't sleep. Watched cargo ships move through the channel until dawn broke gray over the Chesapeake. The bourbon was still sitting on my kitchen counter, where it had been since Thursday afternoon. Pappy Van Winkle 23 year. The label alone was worth framing. The bottle cost what most dock workers earned in a month, $2,800 retail, the kind of whiskey you give someone you're trying to impress or someone you're trying to kill. The sympathy card was tucked under the bottle, cream-colored stock, with Keith's careful script, "For the grief old man, something to help you through the difficult days ahead." I stood in my kitchen Saturday morning, with harbor light coming through the windows, and stared at that amber liquid. Remembered Keith's voice on the audio recording. The bourbon idea could work. Gift from a grateful client. He'd never suspect. Remembered Leora's cold response. Make it look natural. Heart attack, stroke. He's 60. No one questions an old man dying. The bourbon had arrived while I was at Margot's funeral. Keith had probably walked into my building with the same expression of sympathy he'd worn at Ensor Funeral Home, convinced every door attendant and neighbor that he was the grieving son-in-law bringing comfort to the bereaved father. I picked up the bottle carefully using a dish towel to avoid leaving new prints on the glass. On the windowsill above my sink, Margot's orchid sat in its ceramic pot. She'd given it to me 2 years ago for my 60th birthday. White blooms every spring, stubborn roots, the kind of plant that survives Baltimore winters on a third-floor apartment windowsill. I'd kept it alive through 2 years of sporadic watering and benign neglect. You see, Margot always said you were hard to kill, I told the orchid. Let's test that. I broke the seal on the bourbon bottle. The sound was crisp, satisfying. 23 years of aging released into my kitchen's morning air. The scent was oak and caramel, and something underneath I couldn't quite identify. Something bitter. I poured the entire bottle over the orchid's soil. $2,800 of premium whiskey disappearing into potting mix and roots. The soil darkened, saturated. Amber liquid pooled on the windowsill. If I was wrong, I just destroyed evidence and wasted expensive bourbon. If I was right, I just saved my own life. I set the empty bottle on the counter, pulled out my phone, and called Lyle. He answered on the first ring. Eugene, you okay? I need you at my apartment, I said. Bring a soil sampling kit and whatever contacts you have at toxicology labs, private ones that move fast. The bourbon, Lyle said immediately. The bourbon, I confirmed. He arrived within the hour carrying a leather bag that looked like something from a crime scene investigation kit. Probably was Lyle handled enough corporate fraud cases to have connections in forensic analysis. He photographed the bottle, the sympathy card, the orchid, the amber-stained soil, used tweezers to extract a soil sample into a sterile container, labeled everything with the same methodical precision he brought to contract negotiations. Don't touch it directly, he said, sealing the sample. If you're right about this, it's evidence. Chain of custody matters. Yet how fast can you get results, Steinburst? I know a private lab in Bethesda, Lyle said. They do rush testing for criminal defense attorneys. $500 gets you 36 hours. They'd do it, I said. Monday afternoon, Lyle called me from his office. The lab just sent results, he said without preamble. Thallium acetate, 180 milligrams per kilogram. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. Through the window, the harbor was bright with November sunlight. Cargo ships, gulls, normal life continuing around me while Lyle explained how close I'd come to dying. How long would I have had? I asked. 72 hours, Lyle said. Maybe less, depending on dosage and your body weight. The lab says this concentration would have been lethal in a single glass. Death would present as cardiac arrest, irregular heartbeat, chest pain, respiratory failure. No autopsy would flag it unless someone specifically tested for thallium. Which they wouldn't, I said. Because I'm 60 years old and just buried my daughter. Heart attack would be expected. Keith was counting on it, Lyle confirmed. I looked at Margot's orchid on the windowsill. The leaves were already browning at the edges, curling inward like tiny fists. The white blooms from last spring were long gone. The new buds that had been forming would never open. 1 glass, 72 hours. No questions asked. Agent Blackwell needs to see this, Lyle said. The bottle, the card, the toxicology report. This is attempted murder with physical evidence. Oh, bring her the report, I said. I'll photograph the orchid every day, document the deterioration. Eugene, are you safe there? If Keith realizes the bourbon didn't work, he doesn't know I didn't drink it, I said. As far as he's concerned, I accepted his sympathy gift like a grateful fool. He's probably waiting for the phone call saying I had a heart attack. If that makes you more dangerous to him, not less, Lyle said. You're a witness who's still breathing. Then we move fast, I said. How long does Blackwell need? She said a week, maybe 2. Building a federal case takes time. Tell her she has 5 days, I said. Because that's how long I'm willing to pretend I don't know my son-in-law tried to poison me. I hung up and stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the harbor that had been my home for 60 years. The orchid's leaves were completely brown now, the stems drooping, dead or dying from a single bottle of bourbon that should have killed me instead. Keith had been in my apartment, had stood in this kitchen maybe, looked out this same window, calculated exactly how much sympathy and expensive whiskey would convince an old man to drink poison, had written that card in his careful script for the grief old man, and delivered murder wrapped in condolences. The plant was already dead. I'd almost followed it. That same Saturday after Lyle left with the soil sample, I stayed at the window watching Margot's orchid die. The leaves browned hour by hour, curling inward as the thallium, if that's what it was, worked through the roots and stems. Lyle had taken the soil sample to his contact in Bethesda. We'd have confirmation in 36 hours. At noon, my phone rang. Leora. I stared at her name on the screen, remembering her voice on the audio recording. Make it look natural. He's 60. No one questions an old man dying. I answered, Leora. Dad. Her voice was soft, almost fragile. I need to talk to you, privately. There are things about Keith you should know. What things? Not on the phone, she said. Can you meet me that cafe at the Inner Harbor, the one Margot liked? 2 o'clock. The one Margot liked. Perfect detail. Perfectly calculated. I'll be there, I said. The cafe overlooked the harbor from a second-floor terrace. November wind came off the Chesapeake cold enough that the outdoor tables were empty. I arrived 10 minutes early, took a table inside by the window, where I could see the door and the harbor both. Leora arrived exactly at 2, dressed in black cashmere that probably cost more than the Orchid's funeral, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back in a simple knot. The picture of understated grief. She saw me, smiled sadly, and wove through the tables to where I sat. Dad! She leaned down to kiss my cheek. Her perfume was subtle, expensive. Thank you for coming. You said it was important, I said. She settled into the chair across from me, ordered coffee from the waitress who appeared immediately. We sat in silence until the coffee arrived, 2 cups black for both of us. Some things don't change even when everything else does. Leora wrapped her hands around the cup, but didn't drink. I'm worried about Keith, she said. His behavior since Margot died, it's not right. Not right how? Reckless, she said. Making decisions about company assets that Margot would never have approved. Moving money, talking about liquidation plans. Things that should wait until we've all had time to grieve properly. I watched her face as she spoke, concerned, troubled. The devoted younger daughter worried about her brother-in-law's judgment. What kind of liquidation plans? I asked. I don't know all the details, Leora said. He keeps me out of the financial discussions, but I've heard him on the phone talking about offshore accounts and timeline acceleration. Dad, I think he's trying to take advantage of Margot's absence. She said Margot's absence, not death, not loss. Absence like Margot was away on business. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because we're family, Leora said. Her voice was earnest, her eyes wide. I know you and I haven't always been close. I know Margot was always your favorite, the one you trusted with the business. But she's gone now, and we need to protect what she built from people who'd exploit the situation. People who'd exploit the situation. She meant Keith, setting herself up as the responsible one, the ally I could trust. Her hands were perfectly steady on the coffee cup. 30 years watching longshoremen negotiate at the harbor had taught me that guilty hands shake when they lie, but calculating hands don't move at all. What exactly are you proposing, Leora? An alliance, she said simply. You vote with me at the board level, I keep you informed about what Keith's planning, mutual protection. We work together to ensure the company stays in family hands, real family, not someone who married in 7 years ago. There it was, the pitch. Turn me against Keith, position herself as my trusted daughter, control the outcome regardless of which man I sided with. Keith is family too, I said mildly. He was Margot's husband. Was, Leora repeated. Exactly. And now he's acting like he owns everything she built. Dad, Margot would have wanted us to work together. She always said family had to stick together in business. She said Margot's name like she was reading from a script. No weight to it. No pause for the grief that should have been there. Just clinical recitation of facts, Margot said. This Margot believed that Margot would have wanted. I stirred my coffee and watched a cargo ship move through the harbor channel below us. Counted to 5 before I spoke. I appreciate you coming to me with this, I said. But I need time to think. Margot's funeral was only 2 days ago. Everything's still raw. Of course, Leora said immediately. I understand. I just wanted you to know that I'm here, that you're not alone in this. Whatever happens with the company with Keith, I'm on your side. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her skin was warm, smooth. No tremor. Not once in this entire conversation had her voice caught on Margot's name. Not once had her hands shaken or her eyes filled. She was performing grief like a script she'd memorized but never felt. Think about what I said, Leora continued, withdrawing her hand. And call me when you're ready to talk strategy. We can protect what Margot built, Dad, but we have to work together. She finished her coffee, left cash on the table for both our drinks, and stood. The same precise movements she'd always had controlled, measured, nothing wasted. I should get going, she said. Meeting with the accountant at 4. estate things. She leaned down and kissed my cheek again. I love you, Dad. We're going to get through this. I watched her walk toward the cafe, navigate the tables without touching a single chair, disappear down the stairs toward the parking garage. The same stride she'd had at 8 at 16 at her sister's wedding. No grief weighing her down. No loss slowing her step. When she'd said Margot's name, it was like reading from a balance sheet. Sister asset problem solved, not a catch in her voice, not a pause for memory. Just clinical recitation of someone who no longer mattered because she no longer existed. I'd been wrong about who was more dangerous. Keith was greedy and ruthless, I'd heard it in his voice on those recordings. But Leora was something worse. She was cold all the way through. And she'd just sat across from me for 30 minutes, playing concerned daughter, trying to manipulate me into an alliance I'd never honor, testing whether I knew anything about the poison in my kitchen, or the body at Port Covington, or the 8 months of embezzlement documented on Margot's USB drive. She'd mentioned Margot like a solved equation, not a sister. I called Agent Blackwell from the cafe parking lot while Leora's car was still pulling onto Light Street. She said, Sunday morning, 10 o'clock, FBI Baltimore field office. Lyle and I walked through the entrance at exactly 10, carrying a briefcase with 3 days of evidence and the kind of certainty that comes from accusing your family of murder. The FBI field office was concrete and fluorescent lights. We surrendered phones, signed, and received visitor badges. A young agent escorted us to the 3rd floor into a conference room with no windows. Agent Iris Blackwell was waiting at a metal table, mid-40s dark hair, pulled back professional focus that made you choose words carefully. She stood when we entered, shook our hands. Mr. Garrison, she said, nodding to each of us. Please sit. A recording device sat in the center of the table. She pressed a button, stated the date, time, names. Walk me through it from the beginning, she said. My daughter's funeral was Thursday, I said. By Friday afternoon, we'd found a murdered man in her place. Lyle opened the briefcase, laying items on the table in chronological order. Daniel Oakes' employee badge from Port Covington. Photographs of the body. The USB drive Margot had left. Daniel Oakes, 29, compliance officer at Garrison Maritime, Lyle said. Reported as family leave 3 weeks ago. Actually murdered and refrigerated until his body could be substituted for Margot Garrison at Johns Hopkins. Agent Blackwell examined the badge without touching it, made notes. Lyle continued. The USB drive contains 8 months of evidence. Emails between Keith Brennan and Leora Garrison discussing asset liquidation and obstacle removal. Wire transfers totaling over $2 million to offshore accounts. Audio recordings of Keith and Leora planning Eugene's murder. Attempted murder, I said. I'm still here. Lyle placed the toxicology report on the table. Thallium acetate, delivered via bourbon Thursday afternoon, while Eugene was at the funeral, lethal in a single glass. Agent Blackwell read the report carefully. Her jaw tightened slightly. How did you test it? She asked. Poured it over a plant, I said. The plant died. Private lab confirmed the poison. And the bourbon bottle? In my apartment. Keith's fingerprints will be on it, his handwriting on the sympathy card. Lyle added the final pieces. Hospital records showing body temperature inconsistencies. Photographs of Daniel meeting Keith and Leora 4 weeks ago. Death certificate signed by Dr. Cassius Mercer, Margot's personal friend. $2 million in wire transfers. 1 dead compliance officer. 1 bottle of poison. Each piece clicked into place like cargo containers stacking on a ship. Agent Blackwell spent 20 minutes reviewing everything. Asked clarifying questions about dates, amounts, locations. Photographed the evidence. Made notes in precise handwriting. Finally, she set down her pen. If federal charges are viable, she said. First-degree murder for Daniel Oakes, premeditated in furtherance of wire fraud. Attempted murder via poisoning for you, Mr. Garrison. Wire fraud for the offshore transfers. These are federal offenses. What happens next? Lyle asked. I prepare arrest warrants for Keith Brennan and Leora Garrison, Agent Blackwell said. Present evidence to the U.S. Attorney. Coordinate with Baltimore PD. 48 hours, maybe less. Life sentences, federal prison, no parole. I thought about Keith at the funeral, smiling at mourners. Leora in the cafe yesterday, perfectly steady hands. In 2 days, they'd be in handcuffs. Mr. Garrison. Agent Blackwell said, her tone shifting. I need to ask you something directly. I waited. Where is your daughter right now? The question I'd been avoiding since I'd found the note in the casket. I don't know, I said. It was the truth. I didn't know if Margot was in Baltimore or Virginia or somewhere overseas. Didn't know if she was watching me or waiting for some signal. Didn't know anything except that she'd left me breadcrumbs to follow. Do you believe Margot Garrison is alive? Agent Blackwell asked. Lyle shifted beside me. The recording device hummed quietly. Yes, I said, I do. Agent Blackwell made a note. Why? Because she left me instructions, I said. The audio device in the casket, the note directing me to Port Covington, the USB drive with 8 months of evidence she collected. She planned this, all of it, including faking her own death, Agent Blackwell said. Yes. Do you know how she accomplished that? Dr. Mercer signed the death certificate, I said. He's her friend. I assume he helped her. Have you been in contact with your daughter since her reported death? Wan de Daumenskatspiktionand. And notice I said not directly. Indirectly. The note, the evidence. She's communicating, but I haven't seen her or spoken to her. Agent Blackwell closed her notebook and looked at me with professional neutrality that hides assessment. She believed Margot was alive. I could see it in how carefully she'd phrased each question. The FBI wasn't just investigating Keith and Leora's conspiracy. They were investigating my daughter's disappearance and whether I knew more than I was saying. Thank you for bringing this evidence forward, Agent Blackwell said. I'll need to keep all physical items for processing. You'll receive copies for your records. When will you arrest them? I asked. As soon as the warrants are signed, she said. I'll call you before we execute. For your safety, I recommend you stay somewhere Keith and Leora don't know about. If they suspect you've reported them, you could be in immediate danger. Lyle and I left the FBI field office at noon, stood on West Monroe Street in November, cold-watching Baltimore traffic. She thinks you helped Margot, Lyle said quietly. I know, I said. Did you? No, I said, but I'm beginning to suspect Margot is closer than any of us realized. Agent Blackwell believed my daughter was alive. So did I. The question was whether she'd resurface before Keith and Leora figured out their carefully planned murders had failed, and whether I'd survive long enough to see it happen. I spent Sunday afternoon at my Federal Hill apartment, watching the harbor through windows that had framed the same view for 15 years. Agent Blackwell had told me to stay somewhere Keith and Leora didn't know about, but this was my home. Leaving felt like surrender. Agent Blackwell called at 5 that evening, as November dusk turned the inner harbor pewter. I'd been watching cargo ships navigate the channel when my phone lit up with the FBI field office number. Mr. Garrison, she said, I have official confirmation on the Port Covington body. I moved away from the window, sat at my kitchen table. The dead orchid still sat on the windowsill, brown leaves curled tight. Go ahead, I said. Daniel Patrick Oakes, 29 years old, employed in your compliance department since April 2023. Dental records confirm positive identification. The medical examiner estimates time of death between October 30th and November 2nd, which aligns with when he was reported missing. Who reported him? I asked. His landlord, Agent Blackwell said. November 1st when rent went unpaid. But according to your company records, Keith Brennan informed staff on October 31st that Daniel had taken sudden personal leave for family emergency back in Oregon. We all believed it, I said. Nobody questioned it. That's how these things work, Mr. Garrison, Agent Blackwell said. Nobody questions a plausible lie. Daniel's colleagues assumed he'd be back. His landlord assumed he'd moved out without notice. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, he'd been dead 3 weeks. I thought about Daniel's desk at Garrison Maritime, compliance department 3rd floor near the window overlooking the parking lot. I'd walked past it 100 times in the last 3 weeks. Never once wondered where the young man who worked there had gone. What about his family? I asked. No immediate family, Agent Blackwell said. Parents deceased both died in a car accident when Daniel was 22. No siblings. His emergency contact was a college roommate in Portland who hadn't spoken to him in 6 months. No family to notify, no parents waiting for a call that wouldn't come, no siblings wondering why he'd gone silent, just a landlord wondering why the rent stopped and a desk at Garrison Maritime that nobody thought to question. He died alone, I said. Yes, Agent Blackwell said quietly. He did. Cargo ships moved through the harbor below my window, oblivious to conversations about dead compliance officers and murdered sons who nobody missed. The world kept moving while people vanished. "There's more," Agent Blackwell said. Daniel contacted a whistleblower attorney on October 28th, firm out of D.C. that specializes in maritime fraud cases. He told them he had evidence of systematic embezzlement at Garrison. Maritime requested a meeting to discuss protective measures before filing formal complaints. October 28th, the same week Margot had photographed him meeting Keith and Leora at Rusty Scupper. "He was trying to do this the right way," I said. "Yes," Agent Blackwell confirmed. He scheduled an in-person meeting with the attorney for November 3rd. He never showed. The attorney's office called his cell phone, twice left messages. When he didn't respond, they assumed he'd changed his mind. Young whistleblowers get scared back out. It happens. And 2 days after he contacted the attorney, Keith called that meeting. I said, October 30th, Agent Blackwell said. The photographs from Margot's USB show Daniel Keith and Leora at Rusty Scupper from approximately 6 to 7 p.m. We believe that's when Keith learned about the attorney about Daniel's evidence. The meeting was to silence him. October 30th to November 1st. 3 days to kill a man and hide him in cold storage. How did they do it? I asked. Medical examiner found thallium in tissue samples, Agent Blackwell said. Same poison as the bourbon. We believe Keith gave it to Daniel at that meeting, probably in a drink easy to disguise in alcohol. Daniel would have gone home sick, gotten progressively worse over 48 hours, died alone in his apartment. Keith had access to Port Covington through Garrison Maritime contracts. Easy enough to move a body in the middle of the night. I closed my eyes, saw Daniel sitting across from Keith and Leora, earnest young compliance officer, trying to do his job, trying to report fraud through proper channels. Drinking whatever Keith offered, going home, dying alone while Keith waited to use his body as part of Margot's disappearance. The attorney Daniel contacted, I said, do they still have his evidence? No, Agent Blackwell said. He never delivered it. Whatever files he had, Keith took them, probably destroyed them. But we have Margot's USB drive with the same information. Daniel's death won't be meaningless. Oh, when do you arrest them? I asked. Warrants will be ready Tuesday morning, Agent Blackwell said. We'll execute at 6 a.m., simultaneous at Keith's residence and Leora's condo. Federal agents, Baltimore PD backup. First-degree murder conspiracy wire fraud, attempted murder of you. They'll be arraigned Tuesday afternoon. Tuesday morning, 48 hours. Then Keith and Leora would wake up to federal agents at their doors, would be read their rights, would be processed and photographed and locked in holding cells downtown. Mr. Garrison, Agent Blackwell said. Until then, be careful. If Keith or Leora suspect anything, I'll be careful, I said. After she hung up, I stood at my window, watching harbor lights flicker on as darkness settled over Baltimore. Daniel Oakes had been 29 years old, alone in a city where nobody noticed when he vanished trying to do the right thing through legal channels while my son-in-law planned his murder. He'd contacted an attorney, followed proper procedures, believed the system would protect him if he just reported the fraud correctly. And Keith had poisoned him, used his body to fake my daughter's death, left him refrigerated in a storage unit like cargo waiting for shipment. Tuesday morning, Keith and Leora would be arrested, but Daniel would still be dead, and somebody needed to remember that he'd tried. Somebody needed to make sure his death meant something. A young man tried to do the right thing. He deserved better than silence. Monday morning, I called 3 maritime industry publications and Daniel Oakes College Alumni magazine, left my name and number, said I had information about a young compliance officer who died trying to expose corporate fraud, said his name deserved to be in print, not buried in an FBI case file. Then I put on a suit and drove to Garrison Maritime for the emergency board meeting Keith had called. Monday at 2 o'clock, Keith Brennan stood at the head of the boardroom table presenting transition documents 24 hours before FBI agents would walk him out of this building in handcuffs, though he didn't know that yet. The boardroom overlooked the harbor from 12 floors up. Floor-to-ceiling windows, mahogany table that seated 16, the same view of cargo ships and channel markers I'd watched for 35 years. Keith stood where I used to stand presenter's position, the spot that commanded attention. He'd brought a thick binder, transition plan he called it. Professional binding tabs for every section, the kind of document that looked official because someone had spent money making it look official. The transition plan honors Margot's vision while positioning us for growth. Keith said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man addressing his own company. As her spouse, I'm committed to stewarding what she built. Board members sat around the table. Faces I'd known for years, CFO operations director, 3 external board members who represented minority investors. They listened with the careful attention people give to whoever's currently in charge. Leora sat 2 seats from Keith, dressed in charcoal gray, her notebook open but empty. Supportive sister-in-law, grieving family member, she'd perfected the role. I sat at the far end of the table, retired founder invited as a courtesy Keith couldn't refuse without raising questions. Lyle sat beside me, pen in hand but motionless. Keith gestured to the binder. These documents formalize the share transfer and authorize restructuring of certain legacy assets that no longer serve our strategic direction. Legacy assets. He meant the properties Margot had acquired, the contracts she'd negotiated, the foundation she'd spent 8 years building. Timeline for implementation, one of the external board members asked. Immediate, Keith said. Markets reward decisiveness, not hesitation. Margot understood that. She'd want us moving forward, not paralyzed by grief. He said Margot's name like a man who'd loved her, not like a man who'd conspired with her sister to steal everything she'd built, not like a man who'd murdered a 29-year-old compliance officer and tried to poison her father. I watched him present slides about operational efficiency and strategic realignment, watched him smile at board members who asked questions, watched him invoke my daughter's memory to legitimize taking control of her life's work. 24 hours. That's all I had to wait. We're grateful for your presence, Eugene, Keith said, turning to acknowledge me. Your decades of leadership built the foundation we're honored to build upon. I know these technical details might be overwhelming, so please don't feel obligated to engage with every aspect of the transition. Patronizing concern, gentle dismissal of the old man who'd built this company from a single dock supervisor position 35 years ago. I'm just here to observe, I said. Of course, Keith said. Your wisdom is always welcome. He turned back to the presentation, clicked through more slides, talked about modernization and competitive positioning. The board members nodded along, asked clarifying questions about timeline and implementation. Lyle's pen stayed motionless on his notepad. He'd written nothing, just sat beside me, another witness to Keith's performance. Keith distributed signature pages. These authorized the share transfer and operational restructuring, standard succession documentation. Board members signed, passed the pages down the table. Nobody questioned the legitimacy because everything looked legitimate: professional binders, legal language, the widow's husband taking his rightful place. Tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., federal agents with arrest warrants would prove otherwise. I want to acknowledge, Keith said, standing again after collecting the signed pages, that this transition hasn't been easy for our family. Losing Margot was devastating, but she built something remarkable here, and the best way to honor her is to ensure her vision continues. He looked at me when he said it, direct eye contact, sincere expression. Margot would have wanted us to move forward with strength and unity, Keith continued. She believed in this company, in all of you, in the maritime community we serve. That belief doesn't die just because she's gone. The board members were silent, respectful, moved by the grieving husband's determination to carry on his late wife's legacy. I thought about Margot's casket, the laugh that had echoed from inside, the note she'd left directing me to Port Covington, the 8 months of evidence she'd collected documenting every transaction, every email, every conversation. My daughter wasn't gone. She was somewhere planning the next move. And tomorrow morning, when federal agents walked into this building, Keith would learn exactly how well she'd planned. Are there any questions? Keith asked. Nobody spoke. Then I think we're done here, Keith said. Thank you all for your support during this difficult time. Margot's legacy is in good hands. Board members stood, gathered their materials, offered Keith condolences and congratulations in the same breath. Leora accepted sympathetic touches on her arm, played the role of supportive family perfectly. Lyle and I stayed seated until the room cleared. Keith was the last to leave leather binder under his arms, transition document signed and sealed. He stopped at the door, turned back. Eugene, he said. I meant what I said about gratitude. You built something extraordinary here. Past tense, I said. Built, yes, Keith smiled. But your legacy continues, through all of us. He walked out. I sat at the far end of the boardroom table, looking at the empty chair where Keith had stood, the windows behind it, framing the harbor I'd known my entire adult life. Keith smiled at me, across the length of that table, the practiced, confident smile of a man who believes he's already won, who thinks the old man at the end is just there for show. I smiled back. Let him think it. Let him sign every document, make every declaration, seal every part of his own prosecution. Tomorrow morning, the FBI would arrive, and Keith Brennan would learn what it felt like when someone 3 steps ahead finally made their move. Keith left the boardroom believing he'd won. I let him believe it. 24 hours, that's all the performance needed to last. Lyle called at 5 that evening, voice tight with the particular tension that meant he'd found something significant. "Can you come to my office?" he asked. "There's something about the company shares I need to show you before tomorrow's arrests." I drove downtown through rush hour traffic, parked in the garage beneath Lyle's building, took the elevator to the 22nd floor. Lyle's desk lamp glowed amber against the November darkness outside his window. He'd spread documents across the mahogany surface, corporate filings, stock certificates, pages stamped with Delaware Secretary of State seals. "What am I looking at?" I asked. Lyle pointed to a filing dated March 15th. Margot bought 9% of Garrison Maritime 6 months ago. Private transaction with Arnold Hutchins, that retiring minority investor who moved to Florida. I picked up the document, Margot's signature in navy ink. Purchase price $800,000. 9% of outstanding shares transferred to Margot Elizabeth Garrison. "It was quiet," Lyle said. "No press release, no board announcement, just a legal stock transfer between willing parties. Arnold wanted out. Margot wanted in deeper." "Why didn't she tell me?" I asked. "Because she was building something," Lyle said. He pulled another document forward. "Look at the corporate bylaws, the ones we filed in 1989 when you founded the company. I knew those bylaws. I'd written them with Lyle's help 35 years ago. Article 7, Lyle said. Founding shares. You hold 52%. Non-transferable except to direct heirs and only with board approval." "I remember," I said. 52%, Lyle repeated. He wrote numbers on his legal pad. "Plus, Margot's 9% equals 61% of family control. 61%, the magic number in corporate control, the line between voting rights and absolute authority. The Keith's transition documents," I said slowly, "are worthless," Lyle finished. "He can claim Margot's shares as her spouse, but he can't execute any corporate action without your signature on the founding shares. And Article 7 says your shares can only transfer to direct heirs with board approval, which Keith will never get." I sat down in the leather chair across from Lyle's desk. The harbor lights flickered through the windows 22 floors below. "She locked the door," I said. "Before she ever left," Lyle confirmed. "Keith can present all the transition documents he wants. He can sign papers and hold meetings and play CEO. But without your 52%, he controls nothing. Margot made sure of that in March. 8 months before her funeral. 8 months before Daniel Oakes died. 8 months before I found the note in her casket. She knew," I said. "Back in March, she already knew what Keith and Leora were planning. Or she suspected," Lyle said. "Either way, she protected the company before she gathered the evidence, before she faked her death, before any of it." I looked at the filing document spread across Lyle's desk. Delaware corporate records, stock transfer certificates, Margot's careful signatures. "Before I tell you what that 9% really meant, are you still with me? Comment A, if you think Margot planned her disappearance from the start, or B, if you think she was forced into it, and add one reason why in 5 to 10 words. Please note, the next part includes some recreated details for narrative depth. The lesson is what matters." Margot had been playing a different game than Keith understood. While he and Leora plotted asset liquidation and offshore accounts, while they discussed making my death look natural and using Daniel Oakes' body to cover Margot's disappearance, my daughter had been building a cage around them so precise they never saw the bars. The share purchase in March, the compliance audit that brought Daniel Oakes into contact with the fraud, the 8 months of emails and wire transfers documented on that USB drive, the fake death with Dr. Mercer's cooperation, the note directing me to Port Covington, the audio device in the casket, every piece calculated, every step planned. "She did this before any of it started," I said. "Before Daniel died, before she contacted the FBI, before everything. March 24th, Lyle said, pointing to the Delaware filing date. Your daughter spent 8 months building a cage. Keith just doesn't know he's been inside it all along. March 2024, 8 months of planning, 8 months ahead. I thought about Margot at 8 years old, playing chess with Lyle on Sunday afternoons while I worked in my harbor office. She'd beaten him by age 10, beaten me by 12, always 3 moves ahead, seeing patterns nobody else noticed. Tomorrow morning, the FBI arrests them, I said. Yes, Lyle confirmed. But even without the FBI, I continued, even without the evidence, even without Daniel's body, or the poison, or the USB drive, Keith never had a chance, Lyle finished. The company was legally locked the day Margot bought those shares. Everything else was just documentation. I stood and walked to Lyle's window. 22 floors below Baltimore's harbor district glowed with evening lights. Cargo ships moved through the channel, the same view Margot must have seen from this office when she came to Lyle in March, asking him to file the Delaware paperwork, buying 9% of her own family's company to protect it from the people trying to steal it. Where is she? I asked quietly. I don't know, Lyle said, but wherever your daughter is, she's watching this play out exactly the way she planned it. I looked at those filing documents spread across Lyle's desk. March dates, Margot's signature in navy ink, the careful legal architecture of a woman who knew exactly what was coming and built accordingly. She'd been 3 steps ahead from the very first day, and I was only now seeing the board she'd been playing on. Tomorrow, Keith would be arrested for murder and conspiracy. But even without the FBI, even without Agent Blackwell and federal warrants and Daniel Oakes's body in Port Covington, Keith never would have won. Margot had made sure of that before she ever disappeared. I didn't sleep Monday night. Kept thinking about Margot's signature on those Delaware filings, the precision of her planning, the fact that she'd been building defenses in March while Keith and Leora were still plotting their conspiracy. 3 steps ahead, always. Lyle called at 7 Tuesday morning hours before the FBI arrests with one more piece of the puzzle, and it explained everything I'd seen in Leora's eyes at that waterfront cafe. I found something, he said without preamble. Leora's banking records. My contact at the compliance firm flagged an offshore account. I was standing at my kitchen window watching Tuesday's pale light spread across the harbor. Go ahead. Cayman Islands account opened 6 months ago, Lyle said. But not under Leora Garrison. She used her mother's maiden name, Leora Merchant. Francine Merchant was your late wife's name before you married. I remembered Francine's family, Baltimore shipping people old money that had mostly evaporated by the time we met. The Merchants had been respectable once. Leora using that name was deliberate respectability and anonymity combined. How much, I asked. The account structured for a $3.2 million wire transfer from multiple sources, Lyle said. Garrison Maritime operating accounts. The Cayman embezzlement Keith set up, probably Keith's personal accounts too, if she could access them. When there's a one-way first-class ticket booked for Friday, November the 29th at 9 a.m., Baltimore to Miami, Miami to Grand Cayman, private banking relationship already established with Credit Suisse Cayman. Friday morning. 3 days from now. 3 days after yesterday's board meeting, where Keith had signed his transition documents with absolute confidence. And she opened the account in March, I said slowly. March 14th. Lyle confirmed. Same week Margot bought those company shares. Your daughters were both making moves at the exact same time, just in opposite directions. Margot protecting the company, Leora planning her escape. Where did she think she'd get $3.2 million? I asked. Lyle's voice was grim. Garrison Maritime accounts that Keith gave her access to. The offshore money they'd already embezzled. Maybe Keith's personal accounts. She had his passwords, his access codes. She was giving herself exactly 3 days after yesterday's board meeting to liquidate everything and disappear. $3.2 million. Not half of what Keith thought they'd stolen together. Not a fair split between partners. Everything she could extract before vanishing. Keith doesn't know, I said. I doubt it. Lyle agreed. He thinks they're partners. Thinks they're building a new life together once they've stolen your company and eliminated you. He has no idea his partner booked a one-way ticket without him. I thought about that cafe meeting, Leora's steady hands wrapped around her coffee cup, her clinical discussion of Margot's name, her offer of alliance against Keith, testing whether I'd be useful or dangerous, whether I suspected anything or could be manipulated. When neither option worked, she'd simply proceeded with her escape plan. She was never planning to share anything with Keith, I said. He was always the one who'd take the fall. Yes, Lyle said quietly. And call Agent Blackwell, I said. Passport block for Leora Garrison also goes by Leora Merchant. Flight Friday to Grand Cayman. Send her everything you have. Already composing the email, Lyle said. But Eugene, this changes the whole picture. Keith's greedy and violent, but Leora orchestrated this. She pushed him to embezzle to murder Daniel Oakes to poison you, all while planning to take the money and run. One-way ticket, no return, no Keith, no sister, no father, just Leora and money and a Cayman Islands beach where nobody would ask questions about a woman named Merchant with $3 million in Credit Suisse. That Keith thought he was using her, I said. He had it backwards the entire time, Lyle confirmed. I hung up and stood at my kitchen window watching cargo ships move through the channel. Tuesday morning in Baltimore. Somewhere in this city, Keith Brennan was waking up, believing he'd taken control of Garrison Maritime yesterday, believing he'd won. Somewhere else, Leora was probably reviewing her flight confirmation, checking her Cayman account balance, counting down the days until Friday when she'd board that plane and leave her co-conspirator to face federal murder charges alone. And in 3 hours, FBI agents would arrive at both their doors with arrest warrants. My phone rang again 30 minutes later. Agent Blackwell. Passport block confirmed, she said. Leora Garrison and Leora Merchant both flagged. TSA Customs State Department. She won't be boarding any flights domestic or international. And thank you, I said. Your lawyer sent me the banking records. Agent Blackwell continued. This supports premeditated conspiracy. Leora established her exit strategy 6 months before the murder, which proves long-term planning, not crimes of passion. The U.S. attorney will love this. When do you execute the warrants? I asked. Simultaneous at 10 a.m., Agent Blackwell said. Keith Brennan at his residence in Roland Park. Leora Garrison at her condo in Harbor East. Baltimore PD providing backup. Both will be arraigned this afternoon. 3 hours. I thought about that cafe meeting again. How Leora had tested me with her concerned sister act, calculated whether I'd be useful or dangerous. She'd looked at Keith the same way from the beginning, not as a partner, but as a tool disposable once he'd served his purpose. Keith was greedy and violent. He'd murdered Daniel Oakes and tried to poison me. But Leora was something worse. She was patient, methodical, utterly without attachment. She'd orchestrated everything while keeping her hands clean, planned to watch her sister's husband arrested for murder while she sipped champagne at 30,000 feet. She'd viewed Keith as disposable from the start, and in 3 hours both of them would learn what it felt like when the careful plans collapsed. The FBI executed the warrants at 10 that morning. Agent Blackwell called 30 minutes later to confirm Keith Brennan and Leora Garrison, both in federal custody arraignment, scheduled for 4 p.m. I thanked her and hung up. Then I drove to Ensor Funeral Home to sign the paperwork that would cremate the woman who wasn't my daughter. I was signing the final cremation authorization when a woman brought me coffee I never ordered black. No sugar, exactly the way I'd taken it for 40 years. Harold Morrison's office smelled like furniture polish and the flowers from downstairs. Late afternoon light came through the windows overlooking the parking lot. The funeral director sat across from me, reviewing the death certificate one more time. His practiced sympathy unchanged from a week ago when this had all started. The cremation will take place tomorrow morning, Harold said, turning pages in the file. You'll receive the ashes within 48 hours. We use Atlantic Cremation Services, very professional, very dignified. I nodded, signed where he indicated, initialed the acknowledgement that I understood cremation was irreversible. Daniel Oakes would finally get a proper burial. His name would be restored. The young compliance officer who'd tried to do the right thing would no longer be mistaken for my daughter. I know this is difficult, Harold continued, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years conducting these conversations. Signing these forms feels very final. It is what it is, I said. A knock at the door interrupted us. I looked up. A woman in a Navy uniform entered carrying a small tray with 2 coffee cups. Young, maybe late 20s or early 30s, dark hair pulled back in a simple knot. The kind of unremarkable professional appearance that helped people blend into service roles. Coffee, gentlemen, she said quietly. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. Compliments of the house. She set a cup beside Harold, then placed the second cup on the desk in front of me. Steam rose from the dark liquid. Just the way you like it, sir, she said without making eye contact. I stared at the coffee. Black. No cream, no sugar. Exactly how I'd been drinking it since I was 20 years old, working dawn shifts at the Baltimore docks. I didn't order coffee, I said. The woman was already moving toward the door. Courtesy service for family appointments. Is there anything else you need? No, Harold said, picking up his own cup. Thank you. She walked out, closing the door softly behind her. I looked at Harold. You provide coffee service for cremation paperwork. He paused, cup halfway to his lips. We don't actually. That's unusual. Must be one of the new staff being overly attentive. I looked at the coffee, black, no sugar, the way I'd taken it for 40 years, the way Margot had learned to make it when she was 12 years old, bringing me coffee at my office on Saturday mornings, when she'd come to work with me at the harbor. Someone knew. Someone had been watching. Harold continued reviewing the final forms. I signed where he indicated my hand steady, despite the sudden hammering of my heart. That should complete everything, Harold said. Unless you have questions about the memorial service timeline, or... I'm fine, I said. Thank you. I stood, gathered my copy of the cremation authorization. Harold stood as well, offering his hand. Again, my deepest condolences, he said. If there's anything else the family needs... We appreciate everything, I said. I walked toward the door, opened it. The woman in the Navy uniform was in the hallway collecting her tray from a side table. She looked up as I stepped out, then moved past me toward the stairs. As she passed, her hand brushed mine, not accidentally, deliberately. Her index finger pressed against my palm, once, firm, unmistakable. The gesture lasted maybe half a second, but I felt it like an electric shock through my entire body. One press, one firm pressure of her index finger against the center of my palm. A signal we'd created when Margot was 6 years old, terrified of thunderstorms, crying in her bedroom at 2 a.m. while lightning split the sky over Baltimore Harbor. I'd held her hand and taught her our code. 1 press, I'm okay. 2 presses, come find me. 3 presses, danger. She'd used it through childhood, through teenage years when she was out late and wanted me to know she was safe without speaking in front of friends. Through college when she'd signal across crowded rooms that she was fine, that I didn't need to worry. We hadn't used it in years, not since she'd grown up, taken over the company, become the capable executive who didn't need her father's protection anymore. But I knew that touch. I'd taught her that touch 30 years ago. My breath caught. The woman continued down the hallway without looking back. Navy uniform, dark hair, unremarkable appearance designed to blend in to be forgotten the moment you looked away. But that touch, that deliberate pressure against my palm, was unmistakable. Harold stepped out of his office behind me. Mr. Garrison, are you all right? I turned. Yes, fine, just needed a moment. Of course, he said. Take all the time you need. I watched the woman descend the stairs and disappear into the first floor of the funeral home, saw her Navy uniform vanish around the corner. That finger signal, 30 years old, from bedtime stories and scraped knees and her first day of kindergarten, when I'd squeezed her hand 3 times for danger before she walked into that classroom alone, told me everything I needed to know. My daughter wasn't just alive. She was here. She'd brought me coffee exactly the way I liked it. She'd delivered our childhood signal in a crowded funeral home where Harold Morrison stood 15 feet away, completely oblivious. Margot had been watching me this whole time. Through the funeral, through the investigation, through Keith's board meeting, and Leora's cafe performance. She'd been close enough to bring me coffee while I signed papers to cremate someone else's body in her name. I walked down the stairs and out into the November afternoon, got in my car, sat in the Ensor Funeral Home parking lot with my hands on the steering wheel. Keith and Leora were in federal custody. Daniel Oakes would get his name back. The company was protected by Delaware corporate filings Margot had arranged in March. And my daughter had just told me in a language only we understood that she was okay. I drove home from the funeral home with Margot's signal burning in my palm. 1 press, I'm okay. She was alive, she was close, and she was still orchestrating. Before his arrest, Keith had scheduled a second board meeting for Tuesday morning at 9, a final asset transfer to lock everything in he'd announced to the board on Monday. I was already seated when his attorney Philip Morse opened the session at 9 sharp. I said I'd be there. The boardroom at 2 o'clock Wednesday afternoon held 13 people, 200 pages of documents, and 1 perfectly laid trap. Keith stood at the head of the table in a charcoal suit that probably cost what I had earned in my first year at the docks. Leora sat 3 seats down, Black dress, diamond earrings, the picture of composed family support. Board members filled the other chairs. Faces I'd known for years, people who'd built careers at Garrison Maritime. Lyle sat beside me at the far end of the table. His leather briefcase rested against his chair leg. He'd brought his notary seal. We were ready. Philip Morse, Keith's corporate attorney from Morse and Associates, sat directly across from Keith. Mid-50s silver hair, the kind of meticulous document reviewer who prided himself on catching fine print. He'd brought his own briefcase full of files. "Thank you all for coming," Keith said, his voice carrying that practiced confidence of a man who believes he's already won. "I know these past weeks have been difficult. Losing Margot was devastating for all of us. But she built something remarkable here, and the best way to honor her is to ensure strong leadership going forward." He gestured to the document packets in front of each seat. "These formalize the transition plan we discussed Monday. Asset transfers, operational authority board restructuring. Everything Margot and I had discussed before her passing. Lies all of it, but I sat quietly looking defeated exactly as we'd planned." Eugene, Keith said, turning to me with patronizing sympathy. "I know this is hard for you, letting go of what you built, but Margot trusted me to carry this forward. I hope you can too." "Just want to get this over with," I said. Keith smiled. "Of course. Phil, if you'd walk us through the documents." Philip Morse opened his briefcase, pulled out his own annotated copies. "I've reviewed everything. Standard succession documentation, asset transfer agreements, share assignments, operational authority delegation. All legally sound." "Then let's proceed," Keith said. The boardroom door opened. A young man in catering uniform entered, pushing a coffee cart. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said quietly. "Refreshment service for your meeting." He moved around the table, placing cups at each seat. When he reached me, he set down a cup and said softly, "Black no sugar for Mr. Garrison." I looked at the cup, looked at the catering cart. The logo on the side, Harbor Hospitality Services. The same logo I'd seen at Enser Funeral Home 3 days ago, when Margot had brought me coffee and pressed our signal into my palm. She was still here, still watching, still 3 steps ahead. The young man finished distributing coffee and left, closing the door behind him. "Where were we?" Keith asked. "Signature pages," Philip Morse said, flipping through his packet. "Mr. Brennan, you'll sign first as transferee. Mr. Garrison signs opposite as transferor, board members witness." Keith pulled out an expensive pen, started signing pages without reading them, confident, rapid signatures on page after page. "No need to reread what Phil already vetted," Keith said, glancing at me. "Let's finish this." "Take your time," I said mildly. "Want to make sure everything's correct." Keith kept signing. Page 1, page 2, page 3. Lyle watched with the careful attention of a lawyer who knows exactly what's coming. Keith signed page 7 without hesitation, pushed the packet across to me. I signed opposite each of Keith's signatures. Witness signatures, not transfer, just witness to Keith's own commitment. Philip Morse collected the documents when we finished, started reviewing the signature pages one more time, his lawyer's instinct for final verification. He reached page 7. His face went white. "Keith," he said quietly. "Stop." "What?" Keith was already reaching for his coffee. "At page 7. Philip's voice was strained. "This isn't the asset transfer clause." "What are you talking about?" Keith grabbed the packet, flipped to page 7, started reading. The color drained from his face. "That's impossible," he said. "I read every page yesterday. This isn't—" "It's a durable power of attorney," Philip said, reading over Keith's shoulder. "Granting Eugene Garrison complete control over your personal assets effective upon signature. You just signed away authority over your bank accounts, your properties, your investments, and spies." "This is fraud," Keith interrupted, standing abruptly. "Document swap. Eugene, you signed what was in front of you today," I said calmly. "Not yesterday. Document swap works both ways, Keith." Lyle stood, pulled his notary seal from his briefcase. I witnessed the signature. Keith Brennan of sound mind signing a durable power of attorney to Eugene Garrison. All legal, all binding. Keith stared at the document in his hands, then at me, then at Philip Morse. "This is fraud," Keith repeated. "I'll have you arrested. "You signed it," I said. "Phil witnessed it. Legal and binding. Your own attorney verified the documents before you signed them." "The packet was different yesterday," Keith said, his voice rising. "Someone switched—" "Prove it," I said. Philip Morse was reading through the power of attorney language, his professional mask cracking. Keith, this is comprehensive. It grants Eugene authority over every personal asset you own. Your residence, your accounts, your... I know what it says, Keith snapped. Leora had gone completely still in her chair, watching Keith unravel, calculating probably whether this affected her Friday flight to Grand Cayman. Keith opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He had nothing to say. His attorney stared at the signature page like it might spontaneously combust. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The coffee from Harbor Hospitality Services sat cooling in front of each person. Keith had nothing to say against his own signature, witnessed by his own attorney on documents he'd signed without reading. Then the boardroom door opened. Agent Iris Blackwell's entrance was unhurried badge, raised 3 FBI agents behind her, no drama except the kind that ends with handcuffs. Keith Brennan and Leora Garrison. She said, her voice carrying across the boardroom with professional authority. I'm Special Agent Iris Blackwell, FBI, Baltimore Field Office. We have federal warrants for your arrest. Keith was still standing, the power of attorney document in his hand. He stared at Agent Blackwell like she'd materialized from nowhere. On what grounds? Philip Morse demanded, stepping forward. I'm Mr. Brennan's attorney. I demand to see documentation. Agent Blackwell produced 2 folded documents from her jacket. Murder, attempted murder, wire, fraud, conspiracy. Grounds enough, counselor. She handed the warrants to Philip. He read them quickly, his professional composure cracking. This is a setup, Keith said, his voice rising. Eugene, tell them this is Keith Brennan. Agent Blackwell interrupted, stepping closer. You're under arrest for the first-degree murder of Daniel Patrick Oakes on or about October 30th, 2024, and the attempted murder of Eugene Garrison via thallium acetate poisoning. You have the right to remain silent. I didn't murder anyone, Keith said. Eugene is standing right there. I didn't... Forensics recovered thallium acetate traces from your vehicle and residence. Agent Blackwell continued. Daniel Oakes' body was exhumed November 25th. Toxicology confirmed thallium poisoning. Time of death consistent with late October, exactly when you reported him on family leave. Daniel Oakes, the young compliance officer who'd tried to do the right thing, whose body Keith had used to fake Margot's death. You have the right to an attorney, Agent Blackwell said. If you cannot afford... I have an attorney, Keith snapped, gesturing at Philip Morse. Philip held up the warrant. Keith, don't say anything else. Not a word. 2 FBI agents moved forward. One pulled Keith's arms behind his back. Handcuffs clicked into place. Thallium acetate, the same poison that had killed the orchid on my windowsill. The poison meant for me. Leora Garrison. Agent Blackwell said, turning to my younger daughter. Leora had been sitting perfectly still through Keith's arrest. Now she stood slowly, her face composed. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder accessory after the fact to murder and embezzlement of family trust assets, Agent Blackwell said. You have the right to remain silent. I want to cooperate, Leora interrupted. I have evidence, video evidence of Keith preparing the poison, planning everything. I'll testify. I'll give you everything. Keith's head snapped toward her. What? I recorded it, Leora said, her voice urgent. Garage camera footage of Keith mixing the thallium, putting it in the bourbon. I kept it as insurance. I'll cooperate fully in exchange for immunity. Agent Blackwell's expression didn't change. We've had your garage camera footage for 72 hours, Ms. Garrison. Your cooperation is noted for sentencing purposes. It changes nothing about the charges. Leora's face went white. That's impossible. I never... You sent it to an encrypted email address Monday night, Agent Blackwell said. What you didn't know is that the account was already under FBI surveillance as part of our investigation into your offshore banking activities. Leora looked at Keith. Keith stared back with naked fury. You were going to use that against me, he said. You were disposable, Leora said flatly. You always were. Ms. Garrison, Agent Blackwell said. Hands behind your back, please. Another agent stepped forward with handcuffs. Leora held out her wrists not behind her back, resistant to the end. The agent turned her around firmly and cuffed her hands behind her. This is wrong, Leora said. I was trying to help. I was trying to stop Keith. You were trying to take $3.2 million and flee to Grand Cayman on Friday, Agent Blackwell said. We've frozen the accounts. We've blocked your passport. Your flight reservation under the name Leora Merchant has been canceled." Leora's mouth closed. "No more bargaining. No more manipulation." "Eugene," Keith said, turning to me as the agents prepared to escort him out. "You orchestrated this entire thing. The document swapped the FBI, all of it." I looked at my son-in-law, the man who'd murdered Daniel Oakes, who'd tried to poison me, who'd used my daughter's disappearance to steal everything I'd built. "I didn't have to," I said quietly. "You did it to yourselves." "Let's go," Agent Blackwell said. "Federal holding downtown." The agents led Keith and Leora toward the boardroom door, Keith in his charcoal suit that probably cost $4,000. Leora in her designer heels and diamond earrings, both with their hands cuffed behind their backs. Board members pressed back against the walls, giving them space to pass. Philip Morse stood frozen with the arrest warrant still in his hands. Lyle sat beside me, watching everything, with the careful attention of a lawyer documenting events for future testimony. They walked out through the same door they had entered confident just 2 days ago, Monday afternoon, when Keith had presented his transition plan, when Leora had sat composed and supportive when they'd believed they'd won. The boardroom fell silent. Agent Blackwell paused at the door, looked back at me, nodded once. Professional acknowledgement. Then she followed her agents into the hallway. I sat at the conference table looking at the coffee cups from Harbor Hospitality Services still sitting in front of each seat. Margot's network, Margot's planning. The boardroom was silent except for one sound drifting in from the hallway. Someone was clapping, slowly, deliberately. Not applause for a performance, recognition for justice served. I walked out of the boardroom into the hallway. The person clapping stood 20 feet away, silhouetted against the window overlooking the harbor. She stopped when she saw me, lowered her hands, smiled. Margot. Not disguised this time, not in a Navy uniform with her hair pulled back. Just my daughter alive standing in the hallway of the company she'd built. "Press conference at 6, she said quietly. "FBI field office. You should be there." Then she turned and walked toward the elevator before I could speak. The FBI press room held 30 reporters, a dozen cameras, and one resurrection. Agent Blackwell stood at the podium with the FBI seal behind her, professional and composed. Eugene and Lyle sat in the front row of folding chairs. Reporters filled the rest local news maritime industry publications, a few national outlets drawn by federal murder charges against a Baltimore shipping executive. Flash photography illuminated the room in bursts. Today, the FBI arrested Keith Brennan and Leora Garrison on federal charges including first-degree murder, attempted murder, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Agent Blackwell said, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone. Our investigation was aided by a protected witness who provided crucial evidence and testimony. I sat perfectly still. Lyle's hand rested on the armrest beside me, equally motionless. Keith Brennan is charged with the murder of Daniel Patrick Oakes, a 29-year-old compliance officer at Garrison Maritime, and the attempted murder of Eugene Garrison via thallium poisoning. Agent Blackwell continued. Leora Garrison is charged with conspiracy to commit murder accessory, after the fact, and embezzlement. Both are currently in federal custody. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras recorded. I'd like to introduce the individual whose cooperation made this case possible, Agent Blackwell said. She stepped aside from the podium. A side door opened. Margot walked into the press room. The camera flashes increased. Murmurs rippled through the reporters. Someone said, "That's Margot Garrison. She's supposed to be dead." That's my daughter, I thought. That's Margot. She wore a simple gray suit. No jewelry, hair pulled back in a professional knot. She moved to the podium with the same confident stride she'd always had, the one she'd developed walking Baltimore docks at age 16, learning the shipping business from the ground up. "My name was Margot Garrison," she said into the microphone. Her voice was steady, clear. "I faked my death on November 21st under federal immunity to expose the murder of Daniel Oakes and the attempted murder of my father, Eugene Garrison." The press room erupted. Questions shouted over each other. Camera flashes strobed. Agent Blackwell stepped forward. "Please hold questions until the end." The room quieted. Margot continued. "There was no insurance fraud. My life insurance policy was legally voided when I entered federal witness protection in March. No claims were filed. No money was collected. How does a daughter explain to her father why she let him believe she was dead for 6 days? How does she stand at a podium and describe faking her own funeral with the same professional tone she used for quarterly earnings reports? "How long have you been planning this?" a reporter called out. 8 months, Margot said. "Since March, when I discovered Keith Brennan had poisoned my father and realized he'd already murdered Daniel Oakes to cover up systematic embezzlement at Garrison Maritime. 8 months. The same timeline Lyle had found in the Delaware corporate filings. The same month she'd bought those 9% shares. Dr. Cassius Mercer, a retired pathologist and family friend, assisted with medical documentation under FBI supervision, Margot said. He created the death certificate that allowed me to enter witness protection while gathering evidence. Dr. Mercer cooperated fully with federal investigators from the beginning and received prosecutorial immunity in exchange. Everything was legal under my immunity agreement. Dr. Mercer, the name I'd recognized on that death certificate, the man who'd signed Margot's fake paperwork and made it official. The individual in the casket was Daniel Oakes, Margot continued. Keith Brennan murdered him in late October and stored his body in refrigeration at Port Covington. The FBI has recovered Mr. Oakes' remains and notified his family in Oregon. I thought about Daniel, 29 years old, tried to do the right thing, murdered for discovering the truth. Garrison Maritime has been legally dissolved, Margot said. All assets have been transferred to Garrison Harbor Group, LLC, owned solely by my father, Eugene Garrison. Keith Brennan and Leora Garrison have no claim to any company assets or properties. She looked directly at me when she said it. Direct eye contact. Professional. Like delivering a status report. The FBI has surveillance footage, financial records, toxicology evidence, and my testimony, Margot said. Keith Brennan and Leora Garrison will face trial for murder, conspiracy, and fraud. This case is airtight. A reporter raised her hand. Ms. Garrison, what was it like to attend your own funeral? Margot's expression didn't change. I won't be taking questions. Thank you. She stepped away from the podium. Agent Blackwell moved back into position to field the barrage of questions that followed. Margot walked toward the side exit, passed within 5 feet of where I sat. Didn't stop. Didn't look at me again. Just kept walking until she disappeared through the door. Lyle leaned close. She looks like herself again, he whispered. I watched the door close behind my daughter. She looked like herself. Lyle's words stayed with me. The same face, the same stride, the same confident delivery. But something had changed. The woman who'd stood at that podium and explained 8 months of planning, who'd described attending her own funeral with clinical precision, who'd walked past her father without stopping, that wasn't the same daughter who'd brought me coffee on Saturday mornings and laughed at my dock worker stories. She'd survived. She'd won. She'd orchestrated justice with the kind of precision that would send Keith and Leora to federal prison for life. But she'd paid a price I was only beginning to understand. The woman who walked out of that press room wasn't the same daughter who'd hugged me goodbye 8 months ago when this nightmare started. She looked like herself, but she wasn't. Not entirely. The weeks after the press conference moved like cargo through a loading dock, methodical, inevitable pieces clicking into place one by one. Margot stayed in Baltimore, but didn't come home. We spoke twice on the phone, brief conversations about legal proceedings and company paperwork. She sounded like herself. She wasn't. Keith's attorney negotiated a guilty plea, avoided trial, avoided public testimony, avoided Margot sitting across a courtroom, describing 8 months of evidence collection. The sentencing was scheduled for December 15th. December in the courthouse smelled like floor polish and finality. I entered courtroom 4 of the U.S. District Courthouse at 10 that morning. High ceilings wood, paneling the seal of the United States District Court for the District of Maryland mounted behind the judge's bench. Agent Blackwell sat in the gallery, her presence a reminder that federal investigations don't end with arrests. Keith Brennan sat at the defense table in an orange prison jumpsuit, hands cuffed in front of him. 3 weeks in federal detention had made him visibly thinner. His expensive suits were gone. The confident executive who'd presented transition plans was replaced by a man who'd taken a guilty plea rather than face trial. The evidence had been that overwhelming. Judge Raymond Fletcher entered late 60s silver hair, the kind of strict demeanor that came from 30 years sentencing violent criminals. He'd built a reputation for maximum sentences in murder cases. Mr. Brennan, Judge Fletcher said, settling into his chair, you've entered a guilty plea to all federal charges. First-degree murder, attempted murder wire fraud conspiracy. We're here for sentencing. Keith's attorney stood. Yes, Your Honor. The government may proceed, Judge Fletcher said. A USA Sarah Whitfield rose from the prosecution table, mid-40s sharp suit, the lead prosecutor for Maryland's Violent Crimes Unit, who'd personally taken the case when Agent Blackwell brought her the evidence. She'd spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment. Your Honor, she said, the government calls Eugene Garrison to provide a victim impact statement. I walked to the witness stand, raised my right hand, swore to tell the truth. Mr. Garrison, Sarah Whitfield said, please tell the court about October 2024. I looked at Keith. He stared at the table in front of him. I trusted Keith Brennan like a son, I said. He married my daughter, worked at my company for 7 years. I believed he was family. I paused, chose my words carefully. In October, I got sick. Fever, nausea, hair loss, neurological problems. I thought I was dying of natural causes. Thought my body was finally giving out after 60 years. Keith visited me during that time, brought me bourbon, expressed concern. The entire time he was poisoning me. Thallium acetate delivered slowly over 3 weeks. Keith's shoulders tensed. I would have died, I continued. If my daughter hadn't been gathering evidence, if she hadn't left me instructions, I'd be dead. Keith would have inherited my company and nobody would have questioned it. Heart attack at 60, perfectly plausible. Sarah Whitfield nodded. And Daniel Oakes? Daniel Oakes was a 29-year-old compliance officer who worked for Garrison Maritime, I said. He discovered financial fraud. He tried to report it through proper channels. Keith Brennan murdered him, poisoned him the same way he poisoned me, and used his body to fake my daughter's death. Daniel was murdered and nobody knew. Keith made it look like Daniel had taken family leave. Daniel deserved better than that. He deserved better than dying alone and being forgotten. Thank you, Mr. Garrison, Sarah Whitfield said. No further questions. I returned to my seat in the gallery. Agent Blackwell gave me a slight nod. Sarah Whitfield approached the bench with her sentencing memo. Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying through the courtroom, Daniel Oakes was murdered. Daniel Oakes' death was covered up with systematic fraud. Daniel Oakes deserves justice today. She'd said his name 3 times, once for each linked charge, murder, conspiracy, fraud. Daniel Oakes, Daniel Oakes, Daniel Oakes, 3 times, once per charge. The government requests the maximum sentence under federal guidelines. Sarah Whitfield continued. 40 years imprisonment without eligibility for parole. Keith Brennan murdered a young man who was trying to do his job. He attempted to murder his wife's father to steal a family business. He showed no remorse, no hesitation, no humanity. He deserves no leniency. Judge Fletcher reviewed the sentencing memo, read through the evidence summary. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet rustle of pages. Mr. Brennan, Judge Fletcher said finally, do you wish to make a statement before sentencing? Keith looked at his attorney. His attorney shook his head slightly. No, Your Honor, Keith said quietly. Very well. Judge Fletcher set down the memo. Keith Brennan, you have pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, attempted murder, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The court has reviewed the evidence, the victim impact statements, and the sentencing recommendations. This court finds that you demonstrated premeditation, callousness, and complete disregard for human life. You murdered a young man for discovering your crimes. You attempted to murder your wife's father for financial gain. You showed no mercy. This court will show none. He paused. I sentence you to 40 years imprisonment at Federal Correctional Institution, Cumberland, with no eligibility for parole. 40 years at Cumberland. Keith closed his eyes. His attorney put a hand on his shoulder. 2 federal marshals approached to escort him out. Keith stood, hands still cuffed. As they led him past my row, he stopped, looked directly at me. I underestimated you, he said quietly. The marshals pulled him forward. Keith didn't resist, just kept walking toward the courtroom exit, toward the transport that would take him to Cumberland, toward 40 years in a federal prison. You underestimated Margot, I thought, not me. He'd been looking at the wrong opponent the entire time. Thought the old man was the threat. Never saw his wife 3 steps ahead, building a case that would put him away for life. 40 years at Cumberland. Keith would be 82 if he'd lived to see freedom. But he'd never understand who really defeated him. Would spend those 40 years thinking Eugene Garrison had orchestrated his downfall. He was still looking at me instead of seeing Margot. Lyle called the next morning before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. I picked up on the second ring, expecting his voice to carry the same quiet satisfaction it had held after Keith's sentencing. Instead, he sounded tired, worn, like he'd spent the night sorting through facts that didn't add up to justice. "Leora's hearing just ended," he said. 15 years, federal, FCI, Alderson in West Virginia. I set the coffee mug down slowly. 15 years. That was half of what AUSA Whitfield had estimated during our first meeting at the federal building. Half. "She cooperated," I said. It wasn't a question. Lyle exhaled into the phone. "Fully. She gave them everything: offshore account access codes, transaction logs dating back 2 years, testimony about Keith's planning sessions. She even handed over footage from the garage security camera that showed Keith tampering with your bourbon decanter on April 7th. Whitfield said her cooperation was exemplary, complete, no resistance. I stared out the kitchen window at the dogwood tree Margot had planted when she was 12. The branches were heavy with white blooms now. Spring had arrived without asking permission. And Judge Carver accepted the plea. Judge Harriet Carver, Lyle confirmed. She went through the cooperation agreement line by line, acknowledged Leora's assistance in building the case against Keith. Then she gave her 15 years anyway. Said cooperation doesn't erase conspiracy to commit murder. Murder. The word still landed like a fist. My younger daughter had sat in our family kitchen and listened to Keith plan my death. She'd known about the thallium acetate. She'd known about the dosage schedule. She'd said nothing, done nothing. Chosen Keith over her own father. What kind of cooperation makes up for that? How did she look? The question surprised me. I hadn't planned to ask it, didn't want to care. But some part of me, the part that used to read bedtime stories to a 5-year-old with pigtails and scraped knees, needed to know. Lyle hesitated. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Small," Lyle said. "She looked small, Jean. They brought her in wearing the orange jumpsuit from pre-trial detention. No makeup, hair pulled back. She cried when Judge Carver read the sentence, but she didn't make a sound. Just sat there with tears running down her face." I closed my eyes, tried to picture the daughter I'd raised, tried to reconcile that little girl with the woman who'd chosen wealth over family. The math didn't work. It had never worked. Whitfield spoke for 20 minutes, Lyle continued. Detailed every piece of cooperation Leora provided, every password, every offshore shell company structure, every recorded conversation with Keith that proved premeditation. She painted Leora as someone who made a catastrophic choice but ultimately chose truth. And the defense attorney was Philip Chen. Lyle said a public defender assigned after Keith's assets were frozen. He argued for 10 years, claimed Leora was psychologically controlled by Keith, a victim of coercive marriage dynamics. Judge Carver wasn't buying it. The judge told the courtroom that Leora had agency, education, resources, that choosing not to warn your father about poisoning wasn't coercion, it was complicity. The dogwood branches swayed in the morning breeze. I wondered if Margot was awake yet, if she'd already heard about Leora's sentencing, if she felt anything at all for her younger sister. "There's something else?" Lyle said. His tone shifted, became careful. After the hearing ended, Lyle said, "A court officer told me what happened next. They gave Leora one phone call before transport to Alderson. Standard procedure. They led her to the holding area phone and left her there. She picked up the receiver, held it, dialed nothing. The officer said she sat like that for 3 minutes, just staring at the keypad. Then she hung up and told them she was ready. The coffee had gone cold in my hand. 3 minutes. That's how long it took for my younger daughter to realize she had no one left to call. Keith was in federal custody at FCY Cumberland. Margot had made it clear during the press conference that she and Leora were done. And me, I was the father she'd helped conspire to murder. 3 minutes to inventory a life and find it empty. "Jean." Lyle's voice pulled me back. "You still there? I'm here. You okay?" Was I? Keith was in prison for 40 years. Leora was in prison for 15. Margot was alive. The company was secure. Justice by every legal measure had been served. But somewhere in West Virginia, my younger daughter was being processed into a federal facility where she'd spend the next decade and a half, where she'd learn to sleep in a cell, eat in a cafeteria, answer to a number instead of a name, where she'd have no one to call on visiting days because she'd burned every bridge that mattered. "She made her choice," I said quietly. Lyle didn't argue, didn't offer comfort. He knew as well as I did that some choices don't get unmade, some bridges don't get rebuilt. "I'll send you the sentencing transcript when it's filed," he said. "And Alderson allows letters if you ever want to write." I looked at the dogwood tree, thought about Margot planting it with dirt under her fingernails and hope in her voice. Thought about Leora at 7 years old, crying because she wasn't allowed to help. Always on the outside, always wanting in. "Maybe," I said, but we both knew I wouldn't. 15 years. She'd be 49 when she walked free if she served the minimum, if she survived federal prison, if anyone remembered her name by then. My younger daughter had chosen wrong at every turn, and now she had no one. The new office smelled like paint and possibility. Two things I hadn't associated with work in decades. 3 weeks had passed since Leora's sentencing. 3 weeks since I'd learned my younger daughter had no one to call. I hadn't written, probably never would. But I'd done something else instead. Lyle and I stood in the 6th floor space that would become Garrison Harbor Group, looking at empty desks and second-hand chairs that didn't match. "6th floor," Lyle said, glancing at the window. "Little different from the penthouse suite." I walked to the glass and looked down at the working harbor below. Longshoremen unloading containers, forklifts moving pallets, the real work of Baltimore's waterfront happening at eye level instead of far beneath me. "Better view," I said. "Can actually see people working on the docks from here." Lyle smiled, set his briefcase on what would become his desk. 8 of the old crew said they're coming back. Should be here by 9. 8. Out of 43 people who'd worked at Garrison Maritime before Keith's arrest, 8 had chosen to follow me here. The rest had scattered to competitors or retired early. I didn't blame them. Working for a company that had made national news for murder and embezzlement wasn't exactly a resume builder. The conference room was small, 1 table, 10 chairs, a whiteboard still wrapped in plastic, no mahogany, no executive leather, just clean space and December sunlight coming through windows we'd have to wash ourselves. At 9:15 they started arriving. Tom Bradshaw, dock supervisor, who'd worked for me since 1997. Maria Kellerman, logistics coordinator, who knew every shipping lane in the Atlantic. James and Patricia Holt, the married couple who'd run our client services division. 4 others' names I'd known for years, faces I'd trusted, people who'd watched the scandal unfold and decided Eugene Garrison was still worth betting on. They gathered in the conference room. Coffee in paper cups, quiet conversations dying down as I stood at the head of the table. No PowerPoint, no strategic vision deck, just me and the people who'd chosen to be here. "You could have gone anywhere," I said. "Thank you for choosing here." Tom Bradshaw, 62, gray-beard hands that still bore scars from 30 years of dock work, leaned back in his chair. "You treated us fair for 30 years, Mr. Garrison. That counts." I looked around the table, saw loyalty I hadn't earned through fear or money. Loyalty that had survived federal investigations and the humiliation of watching their employer let out in handcuffs. "This time, you're not just employees," I said. "You're partners. 10% equity split among you, equal shares." The room went quiet. Maria Kellerman's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. Patricia Holt glanced at her husband. Tom Bradshaw nodded slowly. "We do this right," I continued. "Garrison Harbor Group becomes something Garrison Maritime never was honest. Small, sustainable. You'll own part of that." By 2 that afternoon, 3 client calls had come in. Small contracts, nothing like the multi-million-dollar shipping deals that used to cross my desk. A regional distributor needing container coordination. An export company looking for customs brokerage. A Baltimore manufacturer wanting logistics consultation. Together, they'd bring in maybe $40,000 over the next quarter, enough to keep the lights on and pay 8 modest salaries. Lyle and I sat by the window overlooking the harbor. The December wind made the water choppy, and gulls circled the piers looking for scraps. 35 years ago, you started with nothing," Lyle said. "Just you and a dock supervisor job. I watched a cargo ship ease into its berth, guided by a tug that looked tiny against the freighter's hull. Now I'm starting with a little more than nothing. At least I know what mistakes not to make. Think Margot will ever join the business. I'd thought about that. Wondered if my older daughter alive, vindicated free from the conspiracy that had consumed 8 months of her life, would want anything to do with the family trade. "Not this one," I said. "She's got her own path now." And Leora, 15 years, FCI Alderson. 3 minutes of silence staring at a phone keypad. Leora made her choice. Lyle didn't push. He knew as well as I did that some doors don't reopen. Starting over at 60 isn't starting from scratch. It's starting from scars. The office emptied by 6. Tom Bradshaw was the last to leave, turning at the door, to nod once before heading to the elevator. Then it was just me standing at the window as the sun set over Baltimore and the harbor lights began to flicker on. I'd brought paperwork home. Should have left an hour ago. But there was one thing left to do. One name that hadn't been honored. I pulled the document from my briefcase drafted 3 days ago, reviewed by Lyle, ready for signature. The Daniel Oaks Memorial Fund. $100,000 from the restructured assets designated for Baltimore Maritime Workers' Safety Training. Annual scholarships in his name. A plaque at the Port of Baltimore honoring the compliance officer who'd tried to do the right thing and died for it. Daniel Oaks. His name on something that matters finally. I signed on the line marked Founder and Administrator, dated it December 18th, 2024. Set the pen down and looked out at the city I'd called home for 60 years. 60 years in this city. Still surprises me. The harbor lights reflected off black water the way they always had. Steady. Constant. Indifferent to human ambition and human failure. Somewhere out there, Keith was in a cell at FCI Cumberland. Somewhere in West Virginia, Leora was learning what it meant to have no one. Somewhere, I didn't know where Margot was building a life that didn't require faking her death to escape. And here on the 6th floor of a modest building in Harbor East, I was building something that didn't require lies to sustain. Tomorrow we'd start again. Smaller, wiser, clean. Daniel Oaks' name would mean something. Dawn at the Inner Harbor looked the same as it had 35 years ago, which meant either nothing had changed or everything had. I stood at the waterfront railing, watching cargo ships move through the channel with the same slow inevitability they'd always had. The same bell buoy clanged somewhere out in the bay. The same cold wind came off the Chesapeake carrying diesel and salt water and wet concrete. 6 weeks had passed since I'd signed papers in an empty office and decided smaller was enough. 6 weeks since the morning I thought I'd buried my daughter. The harbor didn't care. Ships kept moving. Cranes kept lifting. Longshoremen kept working the docks like they had for 100 years. I pulled my coat tighter and watched a container ship ease into its berth, guided by a tug that looked like a toy against the freighter's hull. 60 years old, daughter alive, company smaller, but mine. Daniel Oaks remembered. Some mornings the harbor looks forgiving. Footsteps on the wooden walkway behind me. I didn't turn. Knew the rhythm lighter than Lyle's, more purposeful than a tourist's. Margot appeared at the railing beside me, holding 2 paper coffee cups. She handed me one without a word. Black, no sugar. Some things don't change. You didn't have to come all the way down here, I said. She looked out at the water breath, making small clouds in the cold air. 6 weeks since the press conference where she'd revealed herself alive. 6 weeks since she'd walked out of witness protection into a world that knew her face but not her new legal name. She'd cut her hair shorter, wore glasses now, clear lenses just frames for the disguise of ordinary life. I wanted to see the harbor, she said quietly. Been too long since I watched it work. We stood in silence, sipping coffee that was too hot and tasted like cardboard. A gull landed on the railing 10 feet away, eyeing us for food we didn't have. The bell buoy rang again, steady, mechanical, indifferent. I remembered the sound from her funeral, standing in the rain at Greenmount Cemetery while that same bell clanged somewhere in the distance. 6 weeks wasn't enough time to rebuild what 8 months of deception had torn down. But it was enough to start. Enough for coffee at dawn. Enough for standing together watching ships that didn't care about our drama. Keith's attorney filed an appeal, Margot said. Not a question, just stating a fact the way you'd mentioned the weather. Lyle told me, I said, 40 years is 40 years. Appeals don't change that. And Leora. I took a long drink of coffee. Tasted the bitterness, thought about my younger daughter in a cell at FC, I Alderson learning what it meant to have no one to call. Leora made her choice. Margot nodded, didn't argue. She understood that some bridges burn completely, that some family ties don't survive conspiracy and attempted murder, that forgiveness has limits even blood can't cross. A cargo ship passed close to Shorehorn, blaring louder than I'd expected. Margot flinched, then laughed, genuine and sudden and free. The sound echoed across the water like it used to when she was 6 years old, running on these same docks while I worked overtime shifts. "That horn startled me," she said, still smiling, still loud as ever. "Your mother used to say the harbor was too noisy for civilized people," I said. The memory came easy. My wife standing at this same railing 20 years ago, shaking her head at the diesel fumes and crane noise and constant motion of a working waterfront. She'd wanted me to take an office job, something quiet, something safe. Margot's smile softened. "Good thing we're not civilized. Just honest." Honest. The word carried weight now. 8 months of lies unraveled. A daughter who'd faked her death to expose a conspiracy. A son-in-law who'd murdered a compliance officer and tried to poison me. A younger daughter who'd chosen wealth over family and was paying with 15 years in federal prison. Honesty had cost everything, and honesty had saved what mattered. The bell buoy rang. Same sound, different meaning. At her funeral, it had marked an ending grief and loss and the terrible finality of a casket being lowered into frozen ground. Now it marked time passing, mornings arriving, the slow work of rebuilding trust, one coffee at a time. "That bell buoy rang the day of your funeral," I said. Margot looked out at the water, locating the sound somewhere past the harbor mouth. "I heard it from the FBI safe house," she said quietly. "Thought about you standing there alone? I wasn't alone. Lyle was there, and you were alive somewhere. That mattered." She turned to look at me then, eyes the same gray-green as her mother's, face that carried scars I'd never see 8 months of living as someone else gathering evidence. Knowing her father was being slowly poisoned and trusting the FBI would intervene in time. It mattered, she agreed. We finished our coffee in silence. The cargo ship that had startled her rounded the far point and disappeared into open water, heading for whatever port waited beyond. The longshoremen below moved with practiced efficiency, lifting containers that weighed tons like they weighed nothing. I'd built Garrison Maritime on hard work and loyalty, built it for 35 years, watched it collapse in 8 months when loyalty was purchased and hard work was cover for conspiracy. Now I was building Garrison Harbor Group on different principles, smaller, honest, clean, 8 employees who were partners, clients who paid modest fees for ethical work, a memorial fund honoring a man who died trying to do the right thing. At 60, I'd learned the hardest lesson. Some things you build, some you lose. Some mornings, that's enough. The bell buoy rang one more time. Margot crushed her empty coffee cup and looked at me. "Breakfast?" she asked. "There's a diner 3 blocks from here," I said. "Best hash browns in Baltimore." We walked away from the harbor, together father and daughter, rebuilt on truth instead of secrets carrying scars that would never fully heal but had finally stopped bleeding. The cargo ship disappeared around the harbor point. The bell buoy rang one more time. Margot's hand was warm around her coffee cup. That was enough. And to you listening to my story, remember this family betrayal cuts deeper than any stranger's knife ever could. Looking back, I see the signs I missed. The late-night conversations between Keith and Leora that stopped when I entered the room. The way Keith's sympathy felt wrong the moment he handed me that bottle. The documents I signed without reading carefully. I trusted family blindly because I thought blood meant loyalty. Don't make my mistake. Trust is earned, not inherited, even from those you love most. The hardest lesson I learned at 60 is, this family betrayal doesn't announce itself. It wears the face of love while plotting your destruction. But truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deep it's buried. Margot taught me that courage sometimes looks like death and resurrection. I believe God put me through this trial to show me the difference between family by blood and family by truth. Some betrayals are blessings in disguise, revealing who truly stands with you when everything falls apart. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below. Tell me what you would have done in my place. Would you have forgiven Leora? Would you trust again? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already subscribed to Revenge Dad for more stories about truth, justice, and the price of loyalty. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time matters to me. A final reminder, some details in this story have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental. What remains true is the lesson, and I hope you carry it with you.